The first cool breath of the Somerset Levels meets you just above the reeds, where we begin to follow the slow formation of peat beneath the quiet, wet ground. Settle in and let the day loosen its hold. The air is low and damp here, carrying the soft smell of rushes, dark soil, and water that has lingered so long it seems to have forgotten movement. You are standing, gently, at the edge of a wide, flat world. There are no cliffs to climb, no sharp ridges, no sudden drama. The Somerset Levels spread outward in a patient hush, with ditches shining faintly between fields and willow branches leaning over water the color of tea. Under your feet, the land is not quite firm in the ordinary way. It has depth inside it. It has memory. It has the slow, dark making of peat. We move carefully, because this landscape asks for care. Each step feels as though the ground is breathing very softly below the grass. The surface may seem simple at first, a wet meadow, a reed bed, a low field beneath a pale sky. But beneath that quiet skin, plant matter has been gathering for thousands of years, layer upon layer, pressed in cool darkness, held away from air, and changed slowly into something rich and brown and almost silent. The Somerset Levels are a place where water teaches time to slow down. Rain falls on the Mendip Hills and the Quantocks, and it finds its way into rivers and rhines and shallow hollows. Tides pull at the edges. Mist rests close to the ground. In winter, the fields sometimes mirror the sky so completely that you feel you are walking beside another sky, one laid flat and silver among the reeds. And here, in this damp, breathing world, peat begins with ordinary living things. A sedge blade grows in spring, a reed stem rises, moss thickens in a shaded patch, and willow leaves fall into still water. Nothing seems remarkable as it happens. The plants drink light, bend in wind, fade, and settle. But when they fall into wet ground where oxygen is scarce, they do not vanish quickly. They remain. You can imagine kneeling beside a pool where the water barely moves. Your hand rests near the surface, and the cold comes through your fingers slowly. The smell is earthy and sweet, like old leaves after rain. Beneath the water, dead stems lie in soft confusion, not cleanly gone, not fully whole. Tiny organisms work there, but they work slowly, because the wetness keeps air away, and decay becomes patient. This is the first secret of peat. It is not made by force, it is made by delay. A plant dies, and the marsh holds it. Another season grows above it, and another layer falls. The ground becomes a quiet archive of reeds, roots, pollen, seeds, and darkened fibers. In the Somerset Levels, the archive is deep because the landscape has often been wet enough to preserve what drier ground would release back into air. As we drift further into this low country, the sound of the wider world thins behind us. You hear water tapping softly against a bank. You hear the faint click of reed stems touching in a breeze. Somewhere far off, a bird calls once, then leaves the silence wider than before. The light is gentle here, spread across mist and grass, with no hard edge to it, as though the sky itself has settled into the marsh. The ground remembers old water. Long ago, after the last ice age softened its grip, sea levels rose, rivers shifted, and shallow wetlands formed across this part of Somerset. The levels became a broad meeting place of fresh water, brackish tides, mud, reeds, and open pools. In some places, trees grew in wet woodland. In others, sedges and mosses thickened into mire. All of it fed the slow beginning of peat. You don't need to picture a single moment of creation. It was never like that. Peat formation is a long lowering of energy, a soft accumulation of summers and winters. The roots of one year become the buried floor of the next. Leaves fall, water rises, and the buried plant matter loses its bright green certainty. It darkens, it compacts, it becomes part of the land's deep, damp body. We stay near the surface for a while, because the surface is where the story keeps renewing itself. In a reed bed, the stems lift tall and pale gold, with narrow leaves moving in small, dry whispers. At their bases, the soil is saturated, and the water is cool against the roots. When the reeds die back, their broken stems settle into the wet mat below, joining older stems that have already softened into brown fiber. The science is quiet enough to hold in your breathing. For most dead plants to decay fully, oxygen must be present, because many decomposers need it to work quickly. In waterlogged ground, oxygen disappears from the spaces between particles. The soil becomes anaerobic, which only means that air is scarce there. Decay continues, but more slowly, and some of the plant's carbon remains stored in the dark. That is why peat feels like time made tangible. It is the leftover part of old growth, held beneath water, changed by pressure, chemistry, and waiting. If you were to lift a small piece, it might crumble softly between your fingers. It might smell of earth, rain, and ancient vegetation. It is not stone, yet it is not fresh plant matter either. It is a middle thing, a slow translation. In the Somerset Levels, that translation has shaped the whole landscape. The peat lies in beds and layers, sometimes close to the surface, sometimes buried beneath later silts and clays. Those layers tell of changing conditions, of salt marsh giving way to freshwater fen, of woodland expanding and drowning back, of open water becoming choked with plants. The land has never been still in the sense of being unchanged. It has been still in the way a sleeping body is still, quietly alive with processes too slow to see. And as we move deeper into the making of the levels, the open wetland begins to gather around us more closely. The air cools against your face. A faint mineral smell rises from a ditch, mixed with the green scent of sedge. The light lowers a little, not into darkness, but into that soft grey brightness that belongs to flat, wet places. You can feel how water becomes the main storyteller here. Water decides what decays and what remains. It fills the pores of the soil, covers fallen leaves, and limits the breath of microbes. It carries minerals, acids, and dissolved organic matter through the buried layers. It lifts and lowers with seasons. It glints in straight drainage channels and spreads quietly through hidden hollows. In the Somerset Levels, even when water seems absent from a field, it is often near, waiting below. You may notice how the land has a slight give to it. Not much, just enough to remind you that firmness can be an illusion built over softness. Beneath grass and sedge, the peat may hold water like a sponge. Step by step, we become aware that this is not only a landscape above ground, it is also a landscape below, made of compressed roots, dark fibers, trapped pollen, and the faint chemical record of older climates. Peat grows upward when plant growth exceeds decay. That sentence is simple, but the process is wonderfully patient. In a healthy wetland, each year adds a small amount of new organic matter. Most of it breaks down. Some of it remains. The remaining part may be no thicker than a few millimeters after a long season, and yet, over centuries, those small leftovers become a deep bed of peat. There is comfort in that scale. You are not asked to hurry here. The levels do not hurry, the reeds do not hurry. Even the water seems to move as if it has all night. When we think of landscape formation, we often imagine mountains rising or rivers carving valleys, but peat is different. Peat is a landscape made by keeping. It forms because the marsh does not let go quickly. The life at the surface continues without needing to know the depth below it. Beetles move among wet stems. Snails cling to leaves. Dragonflies rest like small pieces of colored glass in warmer months. Birds step through shallow water, placing their feet with fine precision. Their calls pass over the peat beds, and then the calls are gone, while the ground beneath them keeps its older, slower record. You can picture pollen drifting down, too light to notice. Grains from alder, willow, reed, sedge, and distant grasses settle into water and mud. Some become sealed inside the peat, long after the plants themselves have changed. Those tiny grains can remain, offering a delicate map of what once grew here. The Somerset Levels hold such maps quietly, not as monuments, but as soft dark pages underfoot. And below the living mat, the next layer begins where last year's green has already dimmed. We sink our attention downward, not with weight, but with tenderness. The surface sounds grow muffled in the imagination. The reed whisper becomes a memory. The smell deepens from fresh wet leaves into something older, richer, and more enclosed. Here, the peat is less plant and more earth, though it still carries the shapes of stems and roots within it. In this buried place, pressure is gentle but constant. More growth gathers above, more water presses through. The lower layers compact under the slow weight of seasons, and the spaces between old plant fragments grow smaller. A loose mat becomes denser, brown becomes darker brown. The fibers bend and settle together, like pages in a book that has absorbed rain and then been held closed for centuries. The chemistry changes as the peat deepens. Without much oxygen, different microbial communities take their time with the old plant matter. Acids may build up, nutrients may be limited. The buried remains resist easy breakdown, especially where water stays high and cool. This is why peatlands can store so much carbon. They are not empty wet places. They are vast, quiet storehouses of former sunlight. You can rest with that thought. Former sunlight, lying under your feet. The green blade that once lifted into morning has become part of the dark softness below. The summer heat that fed a reed has been folded into brown fiber. The air's carbon has been taken by plants, then held in wet ground, not for a day or a season, but sometimes for thousands of years. In the Somerset Levels, this storage is woven with the shape of the land. The flatness matters. Water can linger because the gradient is slight. Rivers slow down. Floodwater spreads thinly. Pools remain after rain. Low places fill with vegetation, and vegetation changes the water again, slowing it further, catching silt, creating sheltered pockets where more plants can grow. The wetland builds conditions that help it continue. You can feel that self-making quality in the quiet. A reed bed catches drifting sediment. The sediment steadies the reed bed. The roots slow the water. The slower water lets more fine material settle. Fallen plant matter gathers at the base, and because the base is wet, not all of it decays. The whole system breathes at a pace too slow for ordinary attention, but tonight we are giving it the kind of attention it needs. There is no sharp boundary between life and geology here. The plants are not merely growing on the landscape, they are helping to make it. Each stem is temporary, but the pattern is enduring. Each root dies, but the buried mass remains. Over enough time, biology becomes ground. The Somerset Levels show how a landscape can be built from softness, from repetition, from the smallest acts of growth and rest. And as we descend further into the peat, the daylight above becomes a pale idea, and the wet dark around the old roots feels more complete. The air in your lungs remains easy, because this is only an inward journey, but the mind can sense the closeness of saturated earth. There is coolness here. There is weight. There is the smell of rain held too long to be called rain anymore. Older peat contains fewer recognizable pieces. Some fibers still show where stems once ran, but much has become an intimate dark mass. It may be blackish brown, dense and smooth when wet. It may stain the water like strong tea. This color comes from dissolved organic compounds, from tannins and humic substances, from the long soft alteration of plant tissues in an oxygen-poor world. If you imagine a small core taken from the ground, lifted carefully and laid out in order, you can see time as a column. Near the top, fresh roots thread through younger peat. Lower down, the material darkens and tightens. Deeper still, the layers may speak of ancient wet woodland, of fen, of open water, or of marine influence, depending on where in the Somerset Levels the core was taken. The land has many memories, and each place remembers differently. We do not need to rush through those memories. We can pause beside them, as we would pause beside still water. The levels have shifted between wet phases and drier phases, between natural flooding and human drainage, between peat growth and peat shrinkage. But the old formation of peat belongs especially to long periods when water was allowed to stay, when plants fell into saturated ground and the ground kept them. The word accumulation is a plain word, but it suits this landscape. Peat does not arrive, it accumulates. It gathers by being almost unnoticed. A root hair, a leaf sheath, a strand of moss, a fallen seed head, a film of algae, a mat of sedge, all settling into the same cool keeping. Nothing insists on importance, yet the result becomes a landform, a habitat, a climate record, and a deep reservoir of carbon. You may feel your own thoughts slowing to match it. The day's sharp edges soften. The mind, like the wetland, begins to hold only what can rest quietly. Far above the buried peat, clouds may pass over the Somerset Levels, changing the light on the fields. Below, the old plant matter remains in its dim chamber, unhurried by weather, held in the steady dark. Life continues there, but not in the bright visible way of flowers and wings. Microscopic life moves through the peat's wet spaces. Bacteria and archaea work slowly with the chemistry available to them. In some saturated places, methane can form as organic matter breaks down without oxygen. Even this is part of the peatland's breathing. A low chemical murmur beneath the reeds, shaped by temperature, water level, and the kind of plants that grew above. The plants matter because they leave different kinds of bodies behind. Reeds build tough stems. Sedges weave dense roots. Mosses can hold water and acidify their surroundings. Trees, when they grow in wet carr or swamp woodland, leave wood, leaves, and bark, sometimes preserved in dark layers. In parts of the levels, ancient timber has been found in the peat, softened by time, yet still carrying the shape of former woodland. Imagine that old woodland without drama. Alder roots in wet soil, willow branches low over brown water, ferns and sedges at the edges. The air smells of leaf mold and standing pools. Light comes through in broken green pieces. When a tree falls, it does not disappear into dry rot quickly. It lies in the wet, and the wet folds around it. Slowly, it becomes part of the peat's deeper story. And beneath that memory of trees, the next quiet depth opens, where the Somerset Levels feel less like fields and more like a long conversation between land and water. We follow it downward in thought, through layers made before familiar paths and roads, before the present pattern of drains and meadows, before the ground had the face it wears now. The peat is still there, carrying the shape of earlier wetlands. At this depth, time becomes difficult to measure in ordinary feeling. A century is only a little thickness. A human lifetime may be less than the span between two subtle shifts in the peat. You can breathe slowly with that. Inhale with the reeds above. Exhale into the dark below. The landscape asks nothing fast from you. It simply shows that patient change is still change, even when no single moment seems to move. The formation of peat depends on balance. If water levels fall for too long, oxygen enters, and the stored organic matter begins to break down more quickly. The peat may shrink, oxidize, and release carbon back to the air. If water remains high, the old conditions return, and new plant matter can again be preserved. So peat is both ancient and sensitive. It holds deep time, yet responds to the water of a single season. This makes the Somerset Levels feel especially tender. They are not a hard landscape that resists touch. They are a soft one, shaped by holding and losing water. A dry spell changes the smell of the soil. A wet winter changes the shine of the fields. Floodwater can spread into a broad, quiet mirror, and for a while the levels remember their older self, a wide wetland breathing under a low sky. You can see how stillness here is not emptiness. It is fullness without hurry. The ditch holds reflected cloud. The peat holds old roots. The reeds hold droplets along their edges. A heron holds itself motionless in the shallows, patient in a way that belongs to wet places. Even the mud seems to hold the print of whatever touched it last, preserving contact for a little longer than dry ground would. The peat's darkness is not a frightening darkness. It is the darkness of storage, of rest, of things kept cool and close. Seeds may lie in it, pollen may lie in it, wood may lie in it. The soft remains of old marsh plants may lie together so densely that they become the ground itself. Down here, the world is not absent. It is folded inward. And as we move lower through this folded world, the surface opens into a wider sense of the levels, with mist lying across fields and water shining in the straight lines of rines. The word Rhine belongs to this place, a drainage channel cut through wet ground, carrying water slowly across the flatness. Even these human-shaped waters have become part of the quiet scene, edged by grasses, visited by insects, reflecting the pale sky. But before channels and banks arranged the surface, the natural wetlands spread according to water, sediment, and plant growth. Rivers brought fine material. Tides sometimes laid down silts. Fresh water gathered behind natural levees and in shallow basins. Where open water became shallow enough, plants colonized it. Their stems slowed the water further, and their dead remains built upward from below. In this way, marsh could become fen, and fen could become peatland. You might imagine a shallow pool filling not with stones, but with softness. First, aquatic plants wave under the surface. Then reeds and sedges thicken around the margins. Their dead stems fall into the water. More roots knit the floating and submerged mats together. The open water narrows. The wet ground spreads. Over long periods, the pool becomes less like a pool and more like a trembling meadow, still saturated beneath. This process has a lovely quietness to it. It is succession, but the word can be set gently in the mind. One community of plants changes the conditions for the next. Open water favors one set of lives. Shallow marsh favors another. Fen peat forms where mineral-rich groundwater and surface water feed sedges, reeds, and other wetland plants. The Somerset Levels have held many such transitions, each one slow enough to feel like sleep. As peat thickens, the surface can rise away from direct mineral water in some landscapes, becoming more rain-fed and acidic. In the levels, the story varies from place to place, because the region is broad and low and complex. Some areas are shaped by fen conditions, some by former raised bog, some by marine and river sediments interleaved with peat. The important feeling remains the same. Water, plants and time work together. You can hear rain beginning, very lightly, in the imagination. It touches reeds, ditch water, grass, and the broad backs of leaves. The smell lifts at once, green and earthy. Each drop joins a system much older than itself. Some rain will run away, some will sink, some will help keep the peat wet, protecting the old carbon and allowing the newest fallen stems to settle into the beginning of another layer. There is a kindness in thinking this slowly. The peat did not form because anything strained toward greatness. It formed because ordinary cycles repeated in the right conditions. Growth, fading, falling, soaking, waiting. Again and again, the marsh received what the marsh produced. Nothing needed to be spectacular. The landscape became deep by accepting small things over a long time. And below this rain-darkened surface, we let our attention settle into the older layers again, where the Somerset Levels hold traces of environments that would feel familiar and unfamiliar at once. The air above them is gone. The plants above them are gone. Yet something remains of their presence, darkened and compressed, resting in the wet ground like a memory that no longer needs words. If we could look closely into that buried memory, we would see that it is not uniform, even though it first appears as a continuous dark bed. There are subtle bands where the plants changed, where water rose or fell, where a season or a century leaned wetter than another. You might see a line of darker wood fragments, then a softer layer rich with sedge roots, then a finer place where silt entered quietly with floodwater. The Somerset Levels are written in these changes, not loudly, but with the calm precision of a landscape that has never needed to hurry. The hand can understand peat before the mind fully explains it. Wet peat is cool and yielding, with a dense softness that feels almost alive, though it is made from lives that have already passed into the ground. It stains the skin with a brownness like tea, and it carries a smell that is neither fresh nor rotten, but old, waterlogged, and close. When you imagine holding it, you are holding the work of reeds, mosses, sedges, rain, still pools, and years too numerous to count in any ordinary way. We let that dark handful return to the marsh. It belongs there. The peat in the Somerset Levels is not just material beneath a field. It is part of a living system when water still protects it. At the surface, new plants gather light and carbon from the air. Beneath, older plants remain in slow suspension. Between them, the wetland becomes a place where the present rests gently upon the past, and the past supports the present without ever asking to be seen. As we move through this thought, the sky above the levels grows wider. Low cloud spreads in pale layers, and the wet grasses take on the color of pewter. Your breath seems quieter in such a place, because there are few vertical things to echo it back. A willow may lean over a ditch, or an alder may stand in a damp hollow, but mostly the world is horizontal, and the eye travels softly across reeds, water, fields, and mist, until distance itself becomes blurred. That flatness is part of the peat's origin. In steep places, water runs away too quickly for the same kind of accumulation. On the Somerset Levels, water lingers because the land barely asks it to leave. It gathers in shallow depressions. It spreads after rain. It seeps through soil slowly, bringing dissolved minerals, cooling the root zone, and keeping old plant matter saturated. The land does not build upward by lifting stone. It builds by holding wetness. You can feel the difference between this and a dry woodland floor. In a dry wood, fallen leaves crisp, crumble, and return quickly to the air and mineral soil. Fungi thread through them. Insects and worms break them apart. Oxygen is present, so decomposition moves with a steady appetite. But here, when leaves and stems fall into waterlogged peat, that quick returning is slowed, softened, and interrupted, and the dead plant material becomes part of a longer rest. This does not mean nothing happens below. The deep peat is not asleep in a simple way. It is active at a very low pitch. Microbes still transform compounds. Water still carries dissolved substances through small spaces. Gases form and move. Roots from living plants may enter the upper layers, taking what they need and leaving their own remains behind. Yet compared with dry soil, the pace is hushed, and the buried material keeps more of itself. In the Somerset Levels, that slow keeping has also helped preserve delicate natural clues. Pollen grains, tiny and durable, can rest in peat for ages. Seeds may remain recognizable. Insect fragments can endure. Charcoal dust from old natural fires or distant burning may settle into layers and stay there as a faint dark trace. Each clue is small, but together they let the peat speak of wet woodland, fen, open water, and changing climate in a language of particles. We do not need to make that language complicated tonight. It is enough to sense that every layer has an atmosphere. One layer may belong to a reed swamp, with tall stems rattling softly in wind and water moving around their bases. Another may belong to alder carr, shaded and damp, with roots standing in dark pools. Another may have formed under sedges, where the ground was springy and bright with small wetland flowers. The peat holds them all without preference, and as we sink our attention further, the living surface becomes a thin green glow above us, while the older wetland lies deeper and darker beneath. The cold is more complete here in the imagination. It is not harsh. It is the steady cold of enclosed earth and groundwater, a temperature that changes slowly even when the air above swings through seasons. You can rest inside that slowness, as though the land itself has lowered its voice. The oldest peat in a place can be thought of as the first successful act of holding. Before it formed, there may have been mud, sand, clay, or open water, depending on the local history. Then plants began to colonize the wet surface in enough abundance that their remains accumulated faster than they decayed. From that point on, the ground started keeping an organic layer. Year by year the layer deepened, and the land became more like a wet archive. In the Somerset Levels, that archive was shaped by the meeting of river, tide, rain, and plant growth. The sea has not always stood where it stands now. The coast has shifted in relation to the lowlands, and marine silts have entered parts of the levels at different times. Freshwater wetlands have expanded and contracted. Peat layers may lie beneath clay, or clay may lie between peat beds, showing that the landscape moved between different kinds of wetness. You might imagine the sound of that older tidal influence as something very distant and slow. Not a storm sound, not a harsh sound, but the broad breathing of water across mudflats and creeks. Fine sediment settles from cloudy water and lays a smooth mineral skin over the organic ground. Later, fresh water returns, reeds root again, and peat begins forming above the silt. The Somerset Levels are full of such gentle alternations, a long conversation between the sea's edge and inland wetness. Even now, the scent of a wet field after rain can carry many layers of that story at once. There is the green scent of living grass. There is the iron note of saturated soil. There is the dark sweetness of old organic matter. If the water has been standing, there may be a faint sourness, a sign of oxygen-poor conditions below. These are not unpleasant smells when you receive them slowly. They are the breath of the peatland. You are not outside this scene as an observer at a distance. We are moving through it softly, as if our attention could become as light as mist. You notice droplets along reed leaves, each one trembling but not falling. You notice how ditch water reflects the sky in narrow strips. You notice how sound travels low across open ground, then dissolves among rushes. The whole Somerset Levels landscape seems designed to ask less of the body, less of the mind. That is why peat feels so suited to a sleep journey. It is formation by rest. It is not the snap of eruption or the grind of ice. It is the long result of saturated stillness, with plants growing toward light and then settling down into darkness. When you lie in bed and feel your own weight ease into the mattress, you can picture the marsh doing something similar, receiving each fallen stem and letting it sink into a deeper quiet. Below this, the water changes again in our imagining, not into an oceanic depth, but into a depth of years gathered under grass. The Somerset Levels do not descend by cliffs. They descend by memory. Every inch downward is older. Every layer has been out of daylight longer. The pressure is slight compared with deep stone or sea, but it is constant enough to press loose plant remains into dense peat, slowly closing the little spaces that once held air. Water in peat moves through narrow pathways. It is slowed by fibers, roots, and decomposed organic matter. It may carry a dark stain from dissolved carbon compounds, making pools and ditches look brown, even when they are clear. When the light touches that water, it can shine like polished amber. You can stand beside it and see sky on the surface, darkness below, and the thin reflection of reeds wavering between the two. The chemistry of this brown water matters. Peat can hold acids, nutrients and minerals in ways that shape what grows above it. Some wetland plants are adapted to low oxygen around their roots. Some can move air down through their stems to tissues below the surface. Reeds, for instance, have hollow spaces that help them live in saturated ground. Sphagnum mosses, where they occur in peat-forming systems, can hold remarkable amounts of water and alter their surroundings. In the Somerset Levels, fen plants have been especially important in many areas. Sedges, reeds, rushes, and wet woodland species contributed large amounts of organic matter. Their roots bound the surface. Their stems slowed currents. Their remains fed the forming peat. You can imagine them not as separate individuals, but as a continuous breathing mat, growing, dying, and renewing itself while the wet ground below accepted the fallen material with patient consistency. Life above the peat is often delicate in its details. Small flies hover over the water in mild weather. Spiders string fine lines between reeds. A water beetle breaks the surface and leaves widening rings. Wading birds find food in the softened margins. Each life touches the peatland briefly, then moves on. The peat below does not chase any of it. It simply holds the conditions that allow such quiet abundance to appear. There is a kind of tenderness in that support. The dark material underfoot, made from old plants, helps make room for new ones. It stores water and releases it slowly. It keeps the surface damp. It shapes acidity and nutrients. It influences the communities of roots and microbes that can live there. The past is not gone from the Somerset Levels. It is participating, silently, in the present day. And as we drift onward, the open water in our mind narrows into a dense fen, where green blades and brown stems stand so closely that the air itself seems woven. The light comes through in strips. The smell is stronger now, wet, leafy and mineral, with the faint sweetness of decomposing plants. You can hear the water only when the wind moves the reeds aside, revealing a hidden channel with a slow skin of reflection. This is the scene where peat formation feels most visible. Plants rise from saturated ground, and at their feet lies the soft accumulation of older growth. Each year adds more. In spring, new shoots pierce the damp surface. In summer, leaves spread and gather sunlight. In autumn, stems age and bend. In winter, some collapse into the water, their tissues beginning the long alteration that will either return them to the air or keep them in peat. The balance is never perfectly still. A warm spell can speed decomposition. A dry period can let oxygen reach deeper layers. A flood can bring sediment and nutrients. A change in plant community can alter the kind of material being added. Yet over long stretches, if wetness remains strong enough, the peat persists and deepens. The Somerset Levels were shaped by many such balances, each one held for long enough to leave a layer behind. You can sense the seasons passing without needing to count them. Frost silvering reed stems at dawn, rain dimpling shallow pools, a summer haze over ditches, autumn seed heads loosening in soft wind. Each season has its surface mood, but below, the peat receives the year in a quieter way. What matters to the buried layer is not the brightness of one day, but the amount of plant growth, the height of the water, and the slow chemistry of decay. This makes the landscape feel unusually forgiving to the imagination. There is no single view you must hold. You can wander among reeds, or stand beside a dark pool, or rest your attention on a field that looks ordinary until you remember what lies beneath. The Somerset Levels teach by repetition. Everywhere you look, the same lesson returns with small variations. Wetness holds, plants fall, time deepens, the ground remembers. In the deeper peat, roots from long-dead plants may still be visible as threads and mats. They are the architecture of former surfaces. Once, they held living stems upright in air and water. Now, they lie compressed below other surfaces that came after them. You can imagine them as old floors in a house made entirely of marsh. Each floor built by a generation of plants that grew, faded, and became support for the next. The thought is peaceful because it removes the need for haste. Not every change needs to announce itself. Some of the most important changes are accumulations too slow for the eye. Peat forms in the quiet interval between growth and disappearance. It exists because the marsh delays the final return of plant matter, letting it remain in a softened, altered state. That delay, repeated across ages, becomes a landscape. And now the next layer begins below the dense fen, where the Somerset Levels grow darker in our inward vision, and the surface weather becomes only a faint rumor. The coolness is steady. The pressure of overlying peat is mild, yet continuous. The smell, if it could reach us here, would be deep and enclosed, like wet wood, old leaves and rainwater held in a covered vessel. At this depth, the plant matter has often lost the clear shapes it had near the surface. Some fragments remain, but many tissues have broken down into humified organic material. Humification is only a careful word for the slow transformation of once living matter into dark, stable compounds. In peat, this happens under waterlogged conditions, where the usual pathways of rapid decay are limited. The result is a substance that can endure. You can think of humified peat as a soft darkness made by time. It is not empty blackness. It is full of altered plant chemistry, full of carbon-rich compounds, full of traces of the wet world above. When water passes through it, some compounds dissolve and tint the flow brown. When it dries, it may shrink and crack. When kept wet, it remains swollen and protected, a quiet store of old growth. The Somerset Levels have known both protection and exposure in different places. Some peat remains wet and dark. Some has been drained, cut, dried, or lowered over time. But our focus stays with the natural process itself, the way peat comes into being when wetness is allowed to cradle the dead vegetation. We remain with the slow making, the long preserving, the calm transformation of marsh plants into ground. There is no need to turn this into warning tonight. We can simply feel the delicacy of the balance. Peat asks for water the way sleep asks for darkness. Without enough water, it wakes into decay. With water, it settles back into its old pace. You can hold that gently, as a fact, with feeling inside it. The Somerset Levels, broad and low beneath the sky, are a place where water level is almost a kind of breath. The breath rises in winter. It lowers in summer. It gathers after rain. It withdraws in drier spells. In a peat-forming wetland, the ideal is not violent flooding, but sustained saturation, enough to keep oxygen scarce in the lower layers while plants continue to grow at the surface. That quiet saturation creates the conditions for carbon to remain below ground and for the land itself to thicken by fractions of forgotten seasons. You might imagine lying above it all, not on the wet earth, but in the softened mirror of the thought. Your body is warm and still. The room around you fades. The Somerset Levels spread in your mind as a wide, dim landscape, with water shining between dark banks. Each breath lets you sink a little further into the idea that rest can be productive, that stillness can build, that softness can endure. And as we follow the water table downward and upward through time, the peatland becomes a rhythm rather than a single layer. Wet years protect more material. Drier years allow more loss. Cool temperatures slow the work of decay. Warm conditions stir it. Plants respond to all of this, changing in abundance, sending roots into new spaces, leaving behind remains with different textures. The peat is the record of these rhythms, held in brown and black. In the Somerset Levels, the rhythm also belongs to the wider basin. Rivers such as the Brew, the Tone, and the Parrett have helped shape the lowlands through sediment and water movement. They carry the surrounding landscape inward, grain by grain, dissolved mineral by dissolved mineral. Where their waters slow, fine particles settle. Where wet vegetation dominates, organic matter accumulates. The result is not one simple substance, but a layered wetland earth. You can picture fine clay settling over peat during a flood. The water arrives cloudy and quiet, spreading across low ground. As it stills, suspended particles sink like dust through a room of water. They form a pale or grayish layer over the dark organic surface. Later, reeds may grow through it, and organic accumulation resumes. The peat record becomes interleaved with mineral silence, each layer telling us what kind of water passed through. This interleaving gives the levels their complexity. They are not only peat, and they are not only clay. They are a meeting of processes, each slow in its own way. Peat grows from the remains of plants. Clay settles from quiet water. Silt comes with rivers and tides. Sand may mark stronger currents in some places. Together, these materials create a landscape that is flat to the eye, but deeply varied beneath the surface. The sensory world above keeps us company while we think of this hidden variation. The wind moves across the reeds with a papery hush. Damp air cools the lips. The ground smells darker when disturbed. A ditch carries tiny floating leaves along its edge, barely moving, turning slowly as they pass a clump of rushes. Your attention follows them without effort, because nothing here asks to be solved quickly. That is the pace we keep. We do not hurry toward the bottom of the peat. We wander through its making. The Somerset Levels invite that wandering because their beauty is not only scenic, but temporal. They are beautiful because they show how a landscape can be composed of time held gently in place. A mountain may show time in exposed strata. A peatland shows time in softness, dampness, and a dark ground that yields underfoot. Below this thought we enter another quiet layer, where ancient wet woodland may have stood with roots in black water and branches lifting into a misted sky. The Somerset Levels once held areas where trees could tolerate saturated soils, especially where conditions allowed alder, willow, and other wet-loving species to settle. Their leaves fell into pools. Their roots thickened the wet ground. Their trunks, when they died, sometimes lay in the peat long enough to be preserved. There is something deeply calm about imagining a drowned or waterlogged woodland without fear. Trees stand in shallow water, moss darkens the lower bark, ferns spread in damp shade. The air is still, except for drops falling from leaves. When branches break, they settle into water with little sound, then remain among sedges and roots. Over time, the woodland floor becomes a saturated tangle of wood, leaves and root fibers, all waiting to become part of the peat. Wood decays more slowly in wet, oxygen-poor conditions than it does in open air. Its structure can remain recognizable for a long time, especially when buried quickly in saturated sediment or peat. In some peatlands, ancient trunks appear as dark, softened remains, telling of former surfaces that are now long below the present one. They remind us that a peatland is not fixed as one habitat forever. It shifts between open water, fen, scrub, and wet woodland. You can feel the atmosphere change with each habitat. Open water gives a cool, reflective brightness. Fen gives rustling density and the smell of green stems. Wet woodland gives shade, leaf mold, and brown pools under branches. The peat beneath each one carries a different texture. The levels become a layered memory of atmospheres, as though old weather and old plant communities had settled into the ground and stayed. We walk through these former atmospheres gently, using imagination as our path. You may feel the cool shadow of alder leaves above you. You may hear the slow drip from a branch into standing water. You may smell wet bark and dark mud. The world is muted, close, and green. Beneath your feet, old leaves are beginning their descent into peat, not falling far, just crossing from visible life into the soft keeping below. This is one of the quietest forms of transformation. Nothing disappears all at once. A leaf becomes water dark and heavy. A stem softens. A root dies in place. Microbes and small invertebrates take what they can. The rest remains, changed but present. In the Somerset Levels, so much of the old wetland story is made of this partial remaining, this refusal of saturated ground to let everything pass away quickly. And as the wet woodland fades into fen again, we move with the changing light, down and across, where reeds stand under an open sky and the peat grows from roots more than leaves. Root matter is important in many peatlands because it forms within the saturated zone itself. Instead of falling onto the surface and then sinking, roots grow into wet soil, die there, and leave their tissues already enclosed in low oxygen conditions. This means peat is often made from below as much as from above. You might first picture dead leaves piling up, and that does happen, but the hidden roots are just as significant. They create dense mats. They bind the peat. They add organic matter directly into the wet ground. A sedge tussock, for example, may live partly above the water and partly inside it, building a small mound of old roots and new shoots over time. The feel of such a place is springy and uneven. Your step might press down slightly, then rise back. Water may glimmer in hoof-shaped hollows or between raised clumps of vegetation. The smell shifts as your foot disturbs the surface, releasing the deep, earthy note of saturated organic matter. The sound is soft, a muted suck and release, reminding you that the ground is not a hard floor, but a living accumulation. In the Somerset Levels, where natural wetland processes once spread widely, this root-built fabric helped create broad expanses of organic soil. The process was slow, but it did not need to be dramatic to be powerful. Roots grew every season. Some died every season. Their remains added to what was already there. Water kept the lower mass from fully decomposing. The peat thickened because the living surface kept feeding the dark beneath. There is a gentle lesson in that direction of feeding. We often imagine the past feeding the present, and it does. But in peat formation, the present also feeds the past, laying itself down to become the future's buried memory. Each reed gives something to the layer below. Each sedge root becomes part of a support it will never see. The wetland is a continuous exchange between the green upward reach and the brown downward rest. You can let that exchange become a breathing pattern. Upward with the living reed, downward with the fallen stem, upward with light, downward with water, upward with spring growth, downward with winter settling. The repetition is not sharp or chant-like, but slow and circular, like the movement of mist over the Somerset Levels before dawn, when the fields are pale and the ditches hold the last darkness of night. And below this circular rhythm, another layer waits, where peat is no longer a process we watch, but a substance that has already become. It lies compressed, dark and saturated, with small remains hidden inside it. The upper world may change from year to year, but this deeper peat changes on a slower scale. It is altered by water chemistry, by pressure, by temperature, and by the long absence of open air. At this depth, the lack of oxygen is one of the main guardians. Oxygen is a generous element, but in soils it can also help release stored carbon by supporting rapid decomposition. When oxygen cannot easily enter, the old plant matter remains more intact. The peat may still break down gradually, but it does so through slower pathways. That is why keeping peat wet is so important to its continued existence as peat. The Somerset Levels make this truth visible after heavy rain. Fields shine, ditches fill, low places hold water. The landscape can seem to return toward its earlier wetness, if only for a while. Reflections appear where grass had been. Reeds stand with their bases hidden. The smell of the ground deepens. You can almost feel the peat below relaxing back into the condition that made it, water returning to the spaces where air might otherwise enter. There is no need for drama in this return. Water simply finds its level. It spreads, rests, and seeps. It does what water has always done in low country. Your mind can follow it downward, through grasses, through roots, into the brown body of the peat. There, it fills the hidden pores and slows the work of decay, making the ground cooler, darker, and more enclosed. Tiny bubbles may sometimes rise from wet organic ground. They drift upward through water, reach the surface, and vanish into air with hardly a sound. In some conditions, they carry methane, made by microbes living where oxygen is absent. This is part of the natural metabolism of wetlands. It reminds us that stillness is not lifelessness. The peatland is processing, breathing, exchanging, and transforming, but all of it happens softly, beneath the threshold of ordinary attention. You can imagine watching a bubble loosen from the mud beside a reed stem. It trembles, rounds itself, and lifts. The water closes behind it. A small ring spreads outward, touches another reed, and fades. That is enough movement for this hour. The Somerset Levels do not need more. Even a single bubble can tell us that the buried world is active in its own quiet language. And as we drift through that language, the next movement carries us toward the edges of old pools, where peat formation often begins in the shallows. A pond, a mere, or a slow backwater can fill with plant remains over long periods. Aquatic plants grow beneath the surface. Their leaves and stems die and settle. Silt enters. Reeds advance from the margins. The open water grows smaller, not because it is forced closed, but because life gathers patiently at its edges. The surface of such water might be almost black under a cloudy sky. It smells cool and faintly vegetal. In summer, insects stitch brief paths above it. In winter, the stems at the edge turn pale and brittle, then bow into the water. You can stand there and feel how the boundary between land and water is not fixed. It is a soft negotiation, shifting as plants root, sediment settles, and peat begins to rise. This gradual infilling is one of the peaceful ways wetlands change. Open water becomes marsh. Marsh becomes fen. Fen may become carr or bog, depending on water, nutrients, and climate. The Somerset Levels have carried different versions of this sequence across different areas, shaped by their low elevation and persistent wetness. The process is not a straight line everywhere, but a set of possibilities, unfolding wherever conditions allow plant remains to accumulate. The science, when spoken gently, sounds almost like common sense. Plants grow in water. Dead plants fall into water. Water slows decay. More plants grow on the remains of older plants. The surface thickens. The wetland slowly changes its own shape. Yet inside that simplicity lies great depth, because the result can alter hydrology, habitat, carbon storage, and the very feel of a region underfoot. You may notice how comforting it is that small lives can shape large places. A reed does not know it is building land. A sedge root does not know it is storing carbon. Moss does not know it is changing water chemistry. Yet the landscape emerges from their collective presence. In the Somerset Levels, peat is the quiet outcome of countless unnoticed acts, each one ordinary, each one folded into something vast. And below the edge of that old pool, the forming peat darkens again, receiving another season of stems. The water is colder here in the shade. The mud gives off a low, earthy scent. The sound of the wind is softened by the reed bed, so that you hear more of the tiny things. Droplets, small movements, the faint brush of leaves against one another. We stay with these sounds because they keep the body calm. The body understands repetition before it understands explanation. Reeds moving, water holding, roots sinking, peat forming. The words can lengthen and soften around the process, but the process itself remains beautifully plain. In the Somerset Levels, the making of peat is a slow lullaby of ecology and geology, a joining of living growth and physical preservation. It is both natural history and present sensation, both deep time and the cold, damp smell of the ground tonight. As the buried layers deepen, they also become a climate memory. Pollen reveals what plants lived nearby. Plant fragments show local wetland conditions. The degree of decomposition can suggest how wet or dry the peat was during formation. Mineral layers may mark flooding or tidal influence. Scientists can read these signs with care, but even without instruments, we can feel the larger truth that this dark ground is made from changing relationships between water, plants, and air. You can imagine the peat core again, long and narrow, resting in a tray. It is not glamorous. It is brown, black, fibrous, and damp. Yet it contains a patient record of the Somerset Levels, one that began before the present surface took shape. If you leaned close, you might smell wet earth and old vegetation. You might see thin lines where conditions shifted. The core would not speak loudly, but it would speak deeply. There is peace in records that do not demand attention. The peat has held its information in darkness, whether or not anyone reads it. It does not change its pace to suit us. It simply remains what it is, a soft accumulation of ancient wetland life. Tonight we do not extract anything from it. We only imagine its presence beneath the fields, letting its slowness settle into our own thoughts. And as we sink further through that imagined core, we come to a layer where the Somerset Levels feel almost entirely underwater in memory. Broad, shallow waters spread between rising islands and higher ground. Sedges fringe the edges. Reeds stand in dense beds. The sky reflects in open patches, broken by floating leaves and slow ripples. The air is cool, humid, and full of the smell of water plants. In such places, the earliest stages of peat formation are often delicate. Organic mud may collect first, made of fine plant debris, algae, and mineral particles. As vegetation thickens, larger roots and stems add structure. The material changes from soft lake mud to more fibrous peat as emergent plants take hold. The transition can be gradual, without a clean line. One wet world becomes another by degrees. You can rest in those degrees. Nothing in the marsh insists on a hard boundary. Water becomes mud. Mud becomes peat. Pool becomes reed bed. Reed bed becomes fen. Green becomes brown. Brown becomes black. The transitions are slow enough to be almost invisible, yet they are the very way the landscape is made. The Somerset Levels are a lesson in edges softened by time. At the surface, the light might be fading now. Evening comes wide and low across the levels, and the ditches catch a narrow silver glow. The reeds become darker at their bases, brighter along their tips. Cool air gathers near the wet ground. You may feel it at your ankles first, then around your hands, then along your breathing. The day does not end sharply here. It seeps away. That seeping away feels like peat formation itself. Light enters plants, plants enter water, water enters ground, and ground enters time. The chain is quiet and continuous. When a reed stem falls, it does not fall into emptiness. It falls into a prepared softness, into old stems, old roots, and dark wet matter that already carries the same story. The new layer is received by the old, and the old is pressed a little deeper. This pressing is physical, but it is also almost meditative to imagine. The weight of each new season rests upon the last. Water fills the spaces. Air is excluded. Fibers bend closer together. Chemical bonds shift slowly. The peat becomes more compact, more humified, more resistant to quick change. It is as though the marsh is lowering its own memories into a quieter room, one where they can remain undisturbed for a very long while. And below the evening surface, where the last light no longer reaches, we continue inward through the Somerset Levels, held by the idea of a landscape that forms through gentleness. The dark is complete in the peat, but it is not empty. It is full of past photosynthesis, past rainfall, past root growth, past still water. Everything bright has been changed into something dark, and the darkness is its own kind of preservation. There are minerals here too, quiet companions to the organic matter. Iron compounds may color some wet soils with rusty tones, where oxygen comes and goes. Clay particles may cling to organic surfaces. Calcium-rich waters in some fen systems can influence plant communities and chemistry. The peat is never separate from the wider geology. It rests within a basin shaped by bedrock, river valleys, sea level, and the fine materials carried by water. You can sense that larger setting around the flatness. The Mendip Hills rise to one side, holding stone, springs, and older histories of their own. The peatlands lie low, receiving water that has moved through and over surrounding ground. Rivers thread toward the sea. The Somerset Levels are not isolated. They are a collecting place, a basin of wetness, sediment, life, and slow transformation. Still tonight we keep our attention low. We are not climbing the hills. We are staying with the wet ground, with the places where your boot might sink slightly, where the reed stems brush together, where the smell of peat rises after rain. You can almost feel damp air settling on your skin. It carries a taste of minerals and leaves, and a coolness that encourages the body to loosen. A moth might pass in the dimness. A small sound might move in the reeds and then be gone. The water in the ditch is dark enough to hold the reflection of the first evening star. Beneath that reflection lies silt, then roots, then peat, then older layers of peat and clay. The vertical depth is hidden by a surface only a few inches wide. That hiddenness is part of the calm. The Somerset Levels teach that depth does not always announce itself with height or shadow. Sometimes depth is beneath a flat field. Sometimes it is under a narrow channel. Sometimes it is held in the brown stain of water or the spring of wet ground. You look across an open landscape and think it is simple. Then remember that the real descent is downward through time, into the dark accumulation below. And as night gathers over the reeds, we allow the next layer to be quieter still, a place where peat is protected by its own saturation. The water table sits high enough to keep the buried material enclosed. The living roots above make faint pathways downward. The older roots below no longer draw anything from the world, but they still shape the texture of the ground. Your attention can move among them slowly, like water feeling its way through fibers. Peat has structure, even when it seems amorphous. Some parts are fibrous, with visible remains of stems and roots. Some are more decomposed, smooth and dense. Some contain woody pieces. Some include mineral layers. This structure affects how water moves through it, how it stores water, how it compresses, and how it responds when conditions change. The Somerset Levels hold this variety quietly, beneath surfaces that may look nearly identical. To the listener drifting towards sleep, this hidden variety can become a soft comfort. Not everything needs to be visible to be real. Not everything meaningful stands above the surface. Beneath the ordinary field, beneath the reed bed, beneath the dark line of the Rhine, there is intricacy. The land is layered with things that happen slowly. and those layers remain whether or not the eye can separate them. We stay with that thought as the night air cools. Moisture gathers on grass, the smell of the ditch deepens. Reeds lose their color and become fine dark lines against the sky. Somewhere, water moves so quietly it is almost only a change in reflection. You can breathe in, and the whole Somerset Levels landscape seems to breathe with you, low, damp, and unhurried. In a peat-forming wetland, time is not an abstract idea. It is a substance underfoot. It has weight and moisture. It can be cut by a spade, held in a hand, stained on skin and smelled after rain. Yet it remains time, because it was made by duration. No single reed bed could produce it quickly. No single season could complete it. The peat is the accumulated patience of many plant lives held together by water. And below this patient substance we may reach layers that formed when the surface environment was different enough to feel like another place entirely. Perhaps there was more open water, perhaps there was wet woodland, perhaps a period of mineral sediment covered the organic ground before plants returned. The Somerset Levels have changed repeatedly, but always within the broad mood of lowland wetness, where water spreads, slows, and leaves records. You can imagine a time when mist lay over wider waters at dawn. The sun rose pale behind reeds. The air smelled of mud, algae, and green shoots. Birds moved across the shallows, their reflections trembling. Beneath them, organic mud gathered in quiet hollows. It did not yet feel like peat in the hand, perhaps, but it was the beginning of the same keeping, the first soft layer of a future ground. The beginning of peat is often humble like that. It may start as a thin, dark film among mineral particles. It may begin in a shallow margin where dead leaves collect. It may gather below floating mats of vegetation. At first it is fragile, easily disturbed, mixed with mud and water. But if conditions persist, the organic fraction grows. The layer thickens. The wetland begins to make its own foundation. That foundation changes the plants that can live there. As organic matter accumulates, the surface may become wetter, softer, more acidic, or poorer in certain nutrients, depending on the setting. Plants suited to those conditions gain space. Their remains then reinforce the new conditions. This feedback is one of the quiet engines of peatland development. The landscape is not just passively receiving plant matter, it is slowly becoming a place that favors further accumulation. You can feel that feedback as a kind of lull. The marsh makes peat, and the peat helps make marsh. The sentence turns back on itself, as the landscape does. Water supports plants, plants slow water, slower water supports more plant accumulation. The cycle is gentle, not closed, always influenced by rivers, rain, sea level, and season, but steady enough to deepen the ground through long spans of time. And as we move with that cycle, the Somerset Levels become less like a map and more like a breathing surface over a deep, dark store. The map would show channels, fields, villages, and roads. But tonight we are listening below those lines. We are listening to roots. We are listening to saturated earth. We are listening to the slow hush made when plant matter falls into water and is not fully taken apart. The auditory world is soft enough to hold a sleepy mind. Reed leaves whisper without urgency. Water touches the bank with a small, rounded sound. A distant bird call thins into open air. Even the imagined sound of your step is muted by damp ground. There is no crack of dry twigs, no hard echo, only the cushioned response of a landscape made from softness. The visual world is equally subdued. Brown water, grey sky, green-black reeds, pale grass, low mist. The colors of the Somerset Levels do not need brilliance to be beautiful. They belong to a wetland palette shaped by cloud, reflection, and organic earth. Peat itself holds many browns, from warm, fibrous tones near the surface to dense, blackish layers below. In that darkness, the former brightness of plants has become restful. You may notice how the mind settles when colors soften. Nothing sharp pulls at the eye. The landscape becomes a wide, low room with no walls, only horizons. Under that room, The peat lies as a second quietness, a silence below the silence. We are moving through both at once, the outer wetland and the inner formation, the reeds above and the dark plant memory below. And beneath this second quietness, the next depth carries us toward the edge of raised peat, where in some lowland settings, organic accumulation can rise above surrounding mineral-fed waters. In parts of the broader Somerset wetland history, raised bog conditions developed where peat built upward and became more dependent on rainfall. Such systems are especially nutrient-poor and acidic, shaped by mosses and rain rather than groundwater rich in minerals. The feeling of a raised bog is subtly different from fen. The surface may be spongier, with moss holding water like a living sponge. Pools can shine darkly among hummocks. Plants are often adapted to scarcity, to acidity, to water that offers little mineral nourishment. The air smells clean, damp and faintly resinous where shrubs are present, with the deeper peat smell rising if the surface is disturbed. We speak of this gently because the Somerset Levels include varied peatland histories, not one single type everywhere. Fen peat, car peat, and raised bog peat each carry different plant signatures and conditions. Yet they share the central truth of peat formation, the preservation of plant remains under wet conditions. Whether fed by groundwater or rain, whether rich in sedge roots or moss fragments, peat forms where water slows the return of organic matter. Mosses, especially in many bog systems, have extraordinary peat-making abilities. They grow at the top while older parts die below, and their tissues resist rapid decay. They hold water tightly and can help keep the surface acidic and low in nutrients. Layer after layer, they contribute to the upward growth of peat. You can imagine a moss surface like a soft green quilt, wet to the touch, cool and quietly alive. When your hand rests on such moss, water may rise around your fingers. The surface yields but does not collapse. It feels as though the land has become a sponge under the sky. Beneath it, older moss is turning brown, then darker, then entering the long preservation that makes peat. The process is intimate and almost tender, a vertical passage from green growth into dark rest, repeated across the whole breathing surface. And as the rain-fed surface dims in our imagination, we return to the wider Somerset Levels, where the making of peat belongs to water in all its forms. Rain on moss, groundwater among sedges, river water spreading through hollows, tidal influence leaving mineral layers, mist beading on reeds, dew collecting before dawn. Every kind of water has a role, whether it builds, protects, dilutes, transports, or simply lingers long enough to change what decay can do. The language of water is written in textures. Fibrous peat suggests recognizable plant remains and often less decomposition. Dark amorphous peat suggests greater humification. Silty layers suggest mineral input. Woody fragments suggest wet woodland. Shells, or certain minerals, may indicate more alkaline or marine-influenced conditions in some contexts. The Somerset Levels hold these textures like a quiet library, each layer stored in the only way a wetland knows how to store, by burying and keeping. We move through that library without turning pages sharply. The pages are damp, dark, and slow. Some are made of sedge, some of reed, some of wood, some of moss. Some are interrupted by clay, like a pause in the organic story. Together, they create a record that is not linear in the human sense, but layered in the earth sense, with every new surface resting on the softened remains of earlier ones. There is a deep comfort in being guided by layers. You do not have to hold the whole landscape at once. You can rest with one depth, then another. The surface reed bed, the younger brown peat, the older black peat, the silty flood layer, the buried woodland remains. Each one is enough for a few breaths. Each one leads naturally to the next, and nothing asks you to climb back upward before you are ready. And as we settle still further, the formation of peat becomes almost indistinguishable from the formation of quiet. The processes continue, but the words around them grow softer. Plant matter enters wet ground. Oxygen stays away. Microbes work slowly. Carbon remains, water holds, pressure gathers. The Somerset Levels lie under a broad night sky, and their dark soils keep the memory of wetlands that breathed before this night and will continue after it. You might imagine the stars above the ditches now, faint where mist has thickened. Their reflections appear in water broken by reed stems. The surface of the Rhine is so still that it seems less like a channel than a narrow opening into depth. Below it, the peat is saturated and dark. Above it, the air is cool and still. Between them, the waterline holds the landscape together. At such an hour, the difference between sleep and waking feels as soft as the difference between water and peat. One becomes the other gradually. Thoughts lose their sharp outlines. The body grows heavier. The room around you may still be there, but the Somerset Levels offer another kind of room, low, misted, and held by wet earth. We continue through that room slowly, keeping near the ground, letting the ancient formation below guide the pace. Peat teaches that depth can be made from repetition, and repetition can be restful. There is no need to seek novelty in every moment. The same water, the same reeds, the same darkening fibers, returning again and again, are enough to shape a landscape. The Somerset Levels did not become themselves through one event. They became themselves through persistence, through wet seasons following wet seasons, through plant communities lingering where water allowed them to remain. This persistence has a softness that can enter your breathing. Each inhale is a small rising, each exhale a settling. The reeds rise and settle. The water rises and settles. The peat surface rises over centuries, then may settle under its own weight. Nothing is perfectly still, yet everything moves within a low and gentle range. The whole landscape seems to pulse, not quickly, but with the deep tempo of saturated ground, and below that tempo we descend into an older quiet, where the Somerset Levels hold the remains of plants that never knew the present sky. Their stems grew under earlier light, their roots felt earlier water, their leaves fell into a marsh whose surface has long since been covered by other surfaces. Yet they are still part of the landscape, not as living green, but as dark stored matter, supporting the fields and wetlands above. The thought of that support can feel deeply soothing. You are held, too, by things you do not see. A bed holds the body. Darkness holds sleep. The past holds the present. Wet peat holds the shape of old marshes. None of this needs to be dramatic. It is enough that support exists quietly, below awareness, steadying what rests above it. In the peat, individual fragments lose their separateness over time. A reed stem becomes part of a mass. A sedge root becomes part of a mat. A leaf becomes part of dark humus. The boundary between one plant and another softens, just as the boundary between one year and another softens in the buried record. The Somerset Levels are made from this merging, not into confusion, but into continuity. You can imagine continuity as a feeling under the hand. The peat is not grainy like sand or hard like clay when wet. It is cohesive, fibrous, or smooth depending on its state, with water held throughout it. Pressed gently, it yields. Released, it may hold the impression for a moment. That yielding quality belongs to a landscape formed by accumulation rather than fracture, by wet preservation rather than dry exposure. And as the night deepens, we follow the water into another small hollow, where the surface is covered with rushes, and the air smells of damp stems. The Somerset Levels are full of such modest places, not always grand to look at, but full of process. A hollow stays wet after rain, plants grow thickly, dead matter collects, oxygen is used up, the lower layer becomes dark and soft. Given enough time, a small hollow can join the larger story of peat. This is how the vast can begin in the small. A little depression in the land, a fringe of sedge, a season of standing water, a mat of roots. The conditions repeat, and the organic layer persists. When many small places share these conditions across a broad lowland, they become a regional peat landscape. The Somerset Levels are wide because many acts of wet keeping have overlapped and connected through time. The connection is hydrological as much as botanical. Water links one hollow to another, one ditch to another, one field to another, one river to the sea. It carries nutrients, sediment, dissolved carbon, and temperature. It raises and lowers the conditions in which peat can form or fade. You can picture water as the quiet thread running through the whole levels, stitching together reeds, pools, peat beds, and dark channels under the same low sky. There is something restful about a thread you can follow without hurry. We follow it now past sedges, past wet meadow, past old peat beneath the grass. The thread is not straight, even where channels look straight. It moves through soil, through memory, through seasonal change. It touches every layer. It keeps the buried plant matter from fully returning to air. It is the reason the peat exists, and the reason it can continue to be protected. And beneath this thread of water, the next layer opens slowly, where mineral and organic worlds meet again. Peat is often imagined as purely plant-based, but in real landscapes it mingles with the earth around it. Floods bring silt, groundwater brings dissolved ions. Wind can lay down fine dust. Insects, roots, and microorganisms alter textures. The Somerset Levels are not a sealed vessel. They are open to everything that water gently carries. When mineral sediment enters a peat-forming environment, it can change the surface. It may bury plants, add nutrients, or create a firmer layer. If the wetland remains wet and vegetation returns, peat may resume above it. In a core, such changes appear as bands or transitions. To us tonight, they feel like changes in tone, a darker passage of peat, then a smoother mineral pause, then the fibrous hush of plants again. You can hear that as music if you like, but a very slow music. Reed, water, clay, peat. Rain, root, silt, moss. The elements do not arrive in a sharp list. They overlap like sounds heard through mist. The Somerset Levels are composed in this way, by repeated themes and soft interruptions, by the return of wet vegetation after disturbance, by the tendency of low ground to receive what comes to it. Receiving is one of the landscape's main gestures. It receives rain from above. It receives water from rivers. It receives fine sediment from floods. It receives fallen stems from its own vegetation. It receives cold, mist, pollen, leaves, and time. From all of this receiving, peat is made, not quickly, not evenly, but with the quiet persistence of a place that lies low and lets the world settle into it. The listener, too, can receive rather than effort. You do not need to hold every detail. Let some of them pass like mist. Keep only the feeling of damp grass, low sky, dark water, and old plant matter deepening underfoot. Keep the idea that the Somerset Levels are a soft archive, and that peat is the way a wetland remembers itself when the air cannot reach everything it has grown. And as we move onward, the archive grows darker, but not heavier. There is a buoyancy in wet ground, a hidden lift from water held in pores and fibers. Peat can feel both dense and floating, both earth and sponge. This in-between quality suits the levels, which have always lived between categories, land and water, river and sea, plant and soil, present surface and buried past. At dawn, that in-between quality may be visible as mist. Mist makes the air itself seem waterlogged. It blurs the line between ditch and field, between reed bed and sky. You might stand in it and feel small droplets settle on your face. The world becomes close and quiet. Sound is softened. Distance is shortened. The Somerset Levels, already low and wet, become almost dreamlike, and the peat below seems less hidden than usual, as if the whole landscape were breathing upward. Mist also reminds us that water moves in more forms than one. It is not only flood or pool, it is vapor, dew, seepage, capillary rise, groundwater, rainfall, river flow, and the water held inside living plants. Peat formation depends on the persistence of that water in the ground, but the whole atmosphere participates. A damp climate favors wet soils, cool conditions reduce evaporation, clouded days slow drying. The sky and the peat are connected. You can let that connection soften the sense of separation. Above and below are not separate worlds. Rain falls from above into peat below. Plants draw water upward and send roots downward. Evaporation lifts moisture back to the air. Mist settles again. The cycle is slow on a calm day, but it never stops. The Somerset Levels are one expression of this cycle. A low place where water's return has been especially generous, and beneath the mist, the peat remains dark, holding the residue of many cycles. The plants that made it once participated in the same movement, drawing water, releasing vapor, catching rain on leaves, shading the wet surface below. When they died, they entered the cycle differently, becoming stored organic matter. Their carbon no longer moved quickly through air and life. It rested, and because it rested, the ground deepened. This is one of the reasons peatlands matter far beyond their quiet appearance. They store carbon accumulated from many years of plant growth. In wet conditions, that carbon can remain locked away for long periods. The Somerset Levels, like other peat landscapes, remind us that soft ground can hold a planetary significance without looking monumental. A flat, wet field may contain more ancient carbon than the eye can easily believe. Yet tonight, we keep the significance gentle. We do not turn it into a lecture. We let the fact settle as another layer. Carbon from air became reed, sedge, moss, leaf, and root. Then water slowed decay. Then pressure and time folded the remains into peat. The process is simple enough to sleep beside, and deep enough to wonder about for years. And as the mist lifts slightly, we drift to a place where the peat surface is cut by narrow water, and the reflection of the sky trembles in a dark line. The Somerset Levels are full of these linear waters now, but in the natural imagination they connect us to older channels, backwaters, and wet hollows. Edges are especially alive. At the edge of water, plants grow densely, sediments settle, insects gather, and organic matter accumulates. Edges are also where change can be easiest to sense. The bank may be grassy at the top, then muddy, then root-bound, then submerged. Each inch downward changes the feel. Dry blades give way to damp stems. Damp stems give way to soft black mud. Soft black mud gives way to water, then to submerged peat and silt. Your eye follows the gradient, and your body understands that landscapes are often made across such gradients. At the edge of a ditch, roots hang into the water like fine brown threads. They trap particles and offer shelter to tiny life. When they die, some fall into the channel, and some remain embedded in the wet bank. The water may carry fragments away, or it may leave them lodged among other organic matter. Slowly, the edge repairs and remakes itself. Even in a managed channel, the wetland impulse returns wherever plants and water meet. The Somerset Levels have a powerful wetland memory. Give water a little room, and reeds appear. Let a low place remain damp, and rushes thicken. Allow organic matter to gather, and the smell of peat rises again. The landscape seems to remember how to be wet, how to hold, how to soften the boundary between surface and depth. We can rest with that memory without needing to force it into a lesson. And below that bank where roots enter the dark, we descend again into the slow interior. The peat here is cooler than the air. It does not know the color of the sky directly. It knows water level, pressure, chemistry, and the faint reach of living roots from above. It knows the seasons as changes in temperature and moisture, not as scenery. Its world is tactile, chemical, and enclosed. There is beauty in imagining a world without sight. The peat does not need light to continue its transformations. Microbes respond to available compounds. Water films cling to organic surfaces. Dissolved molecules move through tiny pathways. The old fibers soften further. The darkness is not dramatic. It is simply the natural condition of buried matter. In that darkness, the remains of the wetland are held with extraordinary patience. You can let your own eyes grow heavy with that image. A dark, wet, enclosed place where nothing needs to be seen in order to remain. Above, the reeds and sky carry the visible world. Below, the peat carries the invisible one. The Somerset Levels include both, and the mind can move between them as slowly as it likes, from reflected cloud to buried root, from water surface to carbon store, from breath to sleep. And as sleep comes nearer, the script of the land continues without needing our full attention. Rain will fall again. Reeds will grow again. Some stems will return to the air through decay, and some will sink into saturated keeping. Water will rise, lower, and rise. The peat will remain where it is wet enough, dark beneath the fields, holding the long, quiet record of the levels. We pass now into an even softer part of the journey, where the Somerset Levels feel almost timeless under a low moon. The water in the ditches is black and silver. The grasses are damp at their tips. The air carries the smell of cold earth and old vegetation. Somewhere in the reed bed, a faint movement settles quickly back into stillness. You are not asked to look closely anymore, only to drift with the sense of the place. Still, the making continues. Even in darkness, roots respire. Microbes work. Water holds its level. The fallen plant matter of previous seasons lies pressed into the upper peat, beginning its long change. The newest layer is tender, not yet dense, still threaded with recognizable remains. Below it, older layers wait in deeper browns. Below those, the peat is more compact, more altered, and further from the light that first made it possible. The movement from fresh litter to peat is gradual enough that no single point can be named as the exact moment of becoming. A reed stem does not suddenly turn into peat. It softens, darkens, loses structure, mingles with other remains, becomes less itself and more part of the whole. The Somerset Levels are built from such gentle losses of individuality, where many plant bodies enter one shared ground. There is comfort in that sharedness. The marsh does not preserve every detail, but it preserves enough. It keeps the substance of growth. It keeps traces of form. It keeps chemical memory. It keeps pollen, fibers, and color. In doing so, it turns separate seasons into a continuous body. The peat is not a collection of endings. It is a slow continuity made from what the wetland has given back to itself. And as we continue, the air above the levels grows colder, and the idea of the bed beneath you may begin to merge with the idea of peat beneath the reeds. Both are places of settling. Both receive weight. Both allow the body, or the landscape, to become still. You can sink without falling. You can rest without disappearing. The Somerset Levels hold that kind of descent, low, damp, and immeasurably patient. The deepest calm of peat formation lies in its refusal to rush completion. Even after thousands of years, it is still in process where conditions allow. New roots grow above old ones. New water enters old pores. New plant matter joins ancient material. The landscape is never finished, but it is not restless. It changes the way a sleeper changes position in the night, slowly, almost without leaving the realm of rest. This is why the formation of peat feels like a natural counterpart to sleep. Sleep is not emptiness, it is repair, sorting, lowering, and restoration. Peatland stillness is not emptiness either, it is storage, transformation, and quiet renewal. The Somerset Levels, under mist and moonlight, give us a way to imagine stillness as active in its own deep manner, as something that can build rather than merely pause. And beneath that thought, we return once more to the ground itself, to the dark, wet matter that began as reeds, sedges, mosses, leaves, and roots. It lies cool and saturated. It smells of old rain and shaded earth. It holds water in its fibers and carbon in its altered plant remains. If touched, it would yield. If left wet, it would keep its slow shape. It is humble and profound at once. The surface above may be quiet now, but morning will come in time. Pale light will spread over the Somerset Levels. Mist will lift from the rines. Reed tips will brighten. Birds will move through the shallows. The peat will remain below them, dark and steady, carrying forward the work of all the seasons before. And when another leaf falls, another stem bends, another root dies in saturated ground, the next small part of the long formation will begin to settle. It settles first as something almost too small to notice. A brown strand among other brown strands, a softened piece of last season joining a bed already dark with years. The Somerset Levels receive it without ceremony. Water moves around it. Fine particles cling to it. The open air loses touch with it as more wet matter gathers above. In that quiet enclosure, the stem begins its long passage away from brightness and into the slow, cool language of peat. You can imagine this happening everywhere in the wetland at once, though never in a hurried way. One leaf slips from a willow and lands on dark water. A reed blade breaks and folds into the roots below. A sedge root dies in place, already surrounded by saturated earth. Moss, where it grows, keeps water close against its own older tissues. Every small ending is received into the same soft system, and the ground becomes a little more layered. The new material is not yet ancient. It still remembers air in its shape. It may still show the curve of a leaf, the hollow of a reed, the stringy fineness of roots, but water begins to change the terms of its existence. It is no longer exposed to the quick work of dry decay. It is submerged, pressed, and shaded, held inside a place where oxygen arrives only sparingly, and time moves with the slow patience of the levels. We follow that single fragment downward for a while, because one fragment can stand for many. Around it, the upper peat is a crowded world of roots, water films, softened stems, and the quiet activity of small organisms. The smell would be green-brown here, still partly fresh, still close to the surface. The cold is not deep yet, but it is constant. The light has gone, even though the living reed bed above is only a little way away. In the Somerset Levels, this shallow transition between living mat and forming peat is especially important. It is where the future layer is decided. If the water stays high, more of the material remains. If the surface dries too much, air returns and decay quickens. The same fallen stem can follow different paths depending on the moisture around it. Peat formation is not only about what grows, but about what the wet ground allows to remain. That allowing is delicate, and yet it has created wide, dark stores beneath the lowland. You can stand above them under a pale sky and feel almost nothing dramatic at all. Grass moves softly, a ditch holds its brown reflection. Rushes lean in a mild wind. The atmosphere is ordinary in the best way, unadorned and calm. Then you remember that below the surface, plant matter has been delayed in its disappearance for thousands of seasons. And as we let the fragment sink further into that delay, the present reeds above us become only a muffled idea. The old stem loses some of its structure. Softer tissues break down first. More resistant fibers remain longer. Microbial life takes what it can, slowly, under limited oxygen. The remaining material darkens and begins to blend with the mass around it. It is becoming less a piece of reed and more a small part of peat. There is no sadness in that change. The reed has not failed by losing its form. It has entered the landscape in another way. Its carbon, once held in green tissue, now rests inside dark wet matter. Its minerals may circulate in small amounts. Its hollow stem may collapse and vanish into texture. It belongs now to the Somerset Levels below the visible surface, where countless plant remains have made a ground that is both memory and habitat. You can let that belonging soften the mind. Not everything needs to stay distinct to matter. Some things matter because they join. In peat, a multitude of stems and roots lose their individual outlines, yet together they become something larger and enduring. The wetland does not preserve every shape, but it preserves the fact of growth, the substance of it, the gathered result of sunlight, water and seasons. Above this buried joining, morning might brighten slowly over the levels. A pale line appears beyond the fields. Mist lifts from the rines in thin veils. Dew gathers on the seed heads of rushes. The air has the cool smell of wet grass and dark ditches. If you were walking there, your steps would be softened by the ground, and your breathing would fall into the long horizontal calm of the place. That horizontal calm can be misleading, because below it the vertical story is rich. The Somerset Levels are not high, but they are deep in time. Their peat beds descend through old surfaces, each one once exposed to rain, reeds, birds, insects, and sky. What is buried now was once the top of the world for its own moment. Then more growth came, more water held, more matter settled, and the old surface became a layer. We can think of each layer as a former skin of the wetland. Some skins were reed-rich, some were wooded, some were silty after flooding, some held open water nearby. Each skin lived at the boundary between air and saturation, and each was slowly replaced by another. The process is as gentle as the laying down of blankets, one over the other, until the oldest warmth is far below, still present but no longer visible. In a quiet way, this layering changes the very position of the surface. Peat accumulation can raise a wetland upward over time, though it may also compact and settle. Growth adds material from above and within. Compression reduces thickness below. Water supports the mass. The balance between addition and compaction gives the peatland its slow shape. In the Somerset Levels, that shape has been modified by many conditions, but the natural principle remains beautifully simple. You can picture the wetland breathing upward through plant growth and downward through compaction. Neither movement is abrupt. The surface rises by the small remains of many growing seasons. The lower peat presses tighter under the weight above. Water keeps the whole body saturated enough to resist rapid decay. The result is a landscape that is never still in the strictest sense, yet moves at a pace that feels almost motionless to us. And as our attention moves through that almost motionless body, the soundscape grows softer again. A faint breeze combs through reed stems. Water insects make tiny touches on the ditch surface. Mud releases a low, earthy smell where the bank has been gently disturbed. The sky is wide and grey-blue. You feel the dampness at the edge of your sleeves, the cool air on your face, and the mild enclosing comfort of a place built by water. The peat below keeps receiving. New roots enter it. Old roots become it. Fine organic particles drift down through small spaces. Dissolved compounds stain the water brown. The chemistry is subtle, but its effects are deep. Acidity, nutrients, and oxygen levels influence which plants thrive, which microbes work, and how much organic matter persists. In this way, the forming peat and the living surface constantly shape one another. A sedge community, for example, leaves one kind of material. A reed swamp leaves another. A wet woodland leaves woodier traces. Moss-rich surfaces leave yet another texture. Over long periods, shifts in these communities become visible in the peat profile. But for the half-sleeping mind, it may be enough to imagine the textures changing under the hand, from fibrous to smooth, from rooty to woody, from dark brown to black. The Somerset Levels hold those textures quietly. They do not display them like a cliff face. They keep them under grass, water, reeds and fields. Their geology is a hidden geology, one you sense through softness, wetness, and the color of water. This hiddenness makes the landscape feel intimate, as though it offers its depth only to slow attention. You have to become still enough to notice what the ground is made of. And below the textured layers, we come again to the influence of ancient water. The levels have been shaped by water arriving from uplands, by tides near the coast, by rain across the flatlands, and by groundwater moving through unseen paths. Each kind of water brings a different character. River water may carry silt and nutrients. Rainwater may be softer and poorer. Tidal water may leave mineral signatures. Groundwater may carry dissolved calcium or iron. These differences matter because peat formation is not identical everywhere. Nutrient-rich fens can produce abundant plant growth, especially sedges and reeds. Rain-fed bogs tend to be poorer in nutrients, often favoring mosses and specialized plants. Wet woodland contributes leaves and wood. The Somerset Levels include a mosaic of such histories, and the peat beneath them is varied because the water and plants have varied through time. You can feel that mosaic as a slow walk, though we do not need to take actual steps. First, a reed bed, with stems taller than your shoulder and the dry whisper of leaves. Then a wet meadow, cool under a pale morning, with water hidden just below the turf. Then a darker hollow with willow roots and the smell of wet bark. Then an open pool, still as glass, with old plant matter gathering at its edge. Every part of that walk adds another possibility to the peat. The reed bed gives hollow stems and rhizomes. The meadow gives grasses and fine roots. The willow hollow gives leaves and woody fragments. The pool gives aquatic plants and organic mud. All of them, if held wet enough, can enter the slow process of preservation. The landscape is one story told in different plant voices. And as the walk grows slower, the listener may begin to notice that the body is also becoming a wetland of sensations, receiving and releasing them gently. The breath comes and goes. The bed holds weight. Thoughts drift down like leaves and do not need to be lifted again. The Somerset Levels, with their low mist and dark peat, offer a way to let thinking become less sharp, more saturated, more willing to settle. That settling is not emptiness. It is attention becoming soft. You can still hear the reed stems. You can still smell the damp soil. You can still feel the cool of water imagined near your hand. But none of these sensations demands anything. They gather as the peat gathers, slowly, layered without pressure. The script continues like water moving through roots, finding narrow spaces, lowering its voice as it goes. Beneath the living surface, the peat stores not only plant remains, but also the memory of water levels. A wetter phase may leave less decomposed, more fibrous material because decay was more strongly limited. A drier phase may allow greater decomposition, making the peat more humified. Changes in plant species can also reflect shifting hydrology. The Somerset Levels therefore contain a subtle record of how wetness itself has changed. You might imagine wetness as a line moving up and down through the soil. When the line is high, roots sit in saturation, oxygen fades quickly, and preservation strengthens below. When the line lowers, air enters more deeply, and old material becomes available to faster decay. This line is not visible from a distance, yet it governs the hidden fate of the plant remains. It is one of the quietest rulers of the peatland. The phrase water table may sound practical, but in this landscape it has a poetic softness. It is the level at which the ground is filled with water, the hidden surface beneath the surface. In the Somerset Levels, that hidden surface has risen and fallen through seasons and centuries. It has protected, exposed, renewed, and altered the peat. You can picture it as a dim horizontal plane of coolness, moving slowly through dark earth. And as that plane rises in our imagination, the peat becomes safer from air. Water fills the pores. The smell turns deeper. The color darkens. The old plant matter remains enclosed. The surface above may be bright with green leaves, but below, the world is a brown hush. You can rest in that hush because it is made of protection, not threat, made of water wrapping itself around what the wetland has grown. In winter, the Somerset Levels often feel, especially close to their watery origins. The fields can shine with standing water. The sky seems to lie both above and below. Reeds stand like fine strokes in a pale wash of light. The air smells cold, muddy, and clean. In such conditions, the peat beneath is held in the wetness that made it. The landscape appears to remember, not in thought, but in form. Winter growth is slower, but preservation may be strong. Cooler temperatures slow microbial activity. High water limits oxygen. Fallen autumn material lies saturated through the darker months. By spring, some of it will have softened and changed. Some will be taken up by decomposers. Some will remain, entering the upper peat. The year turns, and the process repeats, with no announcement and no need for witness. Spring returns quietly at first. Fresh shoots rise through old stems. The water at the base of the reeds warms slightly. Insects begin to move over the surface. Roots grow into the wet soil, drawing nutrients from a world partly made of earlier roots. The smell becomes greener, though the dark peat scent remains underneath. The Somerset Levels wake in color, while their buried layers continue in darkness. Summer brings more growth, more leaf area, more photosynthesis. Sunlight becomes plant tissue. Carbon from the air becomes stem, root, and blade. The surface looks full, alive, and textured. Yet even at the height of green abundance, the future peat is already being prepared. Roots that grow now may become dark fibers later. Leaves that spread now will eventually bend and fall. The brightest season is quietly feeding the deepest one. Autumn softens the green into gold, brown, and grey. Reed heads loosen. Sedge leaves fade. Willow leaves drop onto water and mud. The air smells of damp vegetation and cooler rain. Fallen matter gathers in hollows, against stems, and among roots. The Somerset Levels become a place of return, not with sadness, but with completion. What grew upward now begins to settle downward, joining the slow underside of the landscape. And as autumn returns to winter again, the peat receives another layer of the year. The rhythm is so steady that it can carry the listener without effort. Growth fading, falling, soaking, keeping. The words are simple, and the process is older than words. We let them move through the mind as the seasons move through the levels, not as a list, but as a continuous turning of water, plant, and time. The deepest peat is not made only of what fell from above. It also includes the remains of root systems that grew in place. This matters because roots can form dense below-ground networks, adding organic matter directly to the saturated zone. In reed and sedge systems, rhizomes and fine roots may contribute heavily to peat accumulation. The ground is built from hidden growth as much as visible decay. You can imagine those roots in the dark, pale when alive, then browning after death. They thread through saturated soil, seeking stability and nourishment. They hold the surface together against water movement. They create small channels and spaces. When they die, they leave a delicate architecture that slowly collapses into peat. The living plant reaches upward, but its hidden half is already teaching the ground how to remember. The Somerset Levels, viewed this way, are full of unseen architecture, not stone arches or walls, but root mats, fibers, pores, and water pathways. The structure is soft and temporary in each detail, yet enduring in the whole. A single root decays. A whole root mat becomes a layer becomes part of a peat bed becomes part of a landscape. Softness, repeated long enough, becomes foundation. There is a quiet reassurance in that. Strength does not always mean hardness. The peat supports wetland life precisely because it holds water, yields to pressure, and stores what falls into it. Its strength is a patient capacity to receive and remain. You can let that kind of strength into the body as you listen, a strength without tension, a support without strain, a ground made steady by its own long softness. And below this root-built foundation, we sense older surfaces where the air once touched what is now enclosed. Perhaps a sedge tussock stood there. Perhaps shallow water lapped around reed stems. Perhaps alder leaves floated on a shaded pool. The present surface has moved on, but the old one remains as a layer within the peat. The Somerset Levels are a stack of former todays, each one lowered gently into darkness. A former today might have held rain in the morning and mist in the evening. It might have carried the smell of flowering wetland plants, the hum of insects, the faint slap of water against stems. It might have seemed as ordinary to its living creatures as this day seems to us. Then it passed. Its plants aged, its surface changed, and part of it was held. That held part is still underfoot. When we say peat forms slowly, we are really saying that the wetland keeps a portion of its days. Most of a day vanishes. Sound fades. Light moves on. Warmth disperses. But plant matter remains in part, and if water protects it, a trace of that day enters the ground. In the Somerset Levels, enough days were kept to become meters of organic earth in some places, though we keep the numbers soft and unmeasured tonight. The mind can drift through those kept days without needing to arrange them. Some are bright, some are cloudy, some are full of rain, some are hushed under frost. Their details are gone, but their substance remains, transformed into dark peat. You are not hearing a history lesson now so much as being carried by the idea that time can settle, that passing can leave behind a soft and useful depth. And as we continue downward, we reach the places where peat meets clay, or silt, or older ground. The contact may be gradual or clear, depending on how the environment changed. Dark organic matter may give way to grey mineral sediment. A former flood may have laid down fine particles over a peat surface. Later peat may have formed above. These contacts are quiet thresholds, and the Somerset Levels have many such thresholds beneath their flatness. At a threshold between peat and clay, the feel would change under the fingers. Peat is organic, dark and often fibrous. Clay is mineral, smooth and cool, with a different kind of plastic softness. Both hold water, but they hold it differently. Clay can seal and slow drainage. Peat can absorb and store. Together they shape how water moves through the lowland, influencing the wetness on which future peat depends. You can picture a grey clay layer lying like a calm pause between darker beds. It may speak of a time when water carried more mineral sediment, perhaps from flooding or tidal influence. Then above it, plant remains begin to dominate again. The dark returns. The peat resumes. The landscape does not treat interruption as an ending. It accepts the pause, then continues when conditions allow. This is one of the restful patterns in nature. Processes stop and start, weaken and strengthen, but they do not need to be perfect to matter. Peat formation in the Somerset Levels has followed the opportunities given by water, plants, and land shape. Where wetness endured, peat accumulated. Where sediment entered, the record shifted. Where plants returned, organic layers grew again. The whole history is adaptive, layered, and calm. And above these hidden thresholds, the surface may look seamless. A field spreads under cloud. A line of reeds marks a ditch. A willow leans in a damp corner. You would not know just by looking where the buried clay lies or where an older peat surface begins. That hidden complexity gives the landscape a quiet depth, like a voice speaking softly beneath an ordinary sentence. We listen to that softer voice. It tells us that the Somerset Levels are made of patient interactions, not isolated facts. Water shapes plants. Plants shape soil. Soil shapes water. Climate shapes them all. The sea has approached and withdrawn. Rivers have carried and laid down sediment. Wetlands have grown, drowned, renewed and thickened. Peat is one of the deepest expressions of this long interaction, because it turns life into ground. Life into ground is a simple phrase, but it holds the whole descent. A reed is alive in light, then becomes matter in darkness. A root holds a plant steady, then becomes part of the soil it once penetrated. A moss grows upward, while its older parts enter the peat below. The Somerset Levels have been formed, in part, by this continuous crossing from living tissue into geological presence. You can feel how peaceful that crossing becomes when it is slowed by water. In dry decay, the return can seem brisk and complete. In wet peat formation, the return is extended, almost suspended. Plant matter does not rush away, it lingers in altered form. The wetland keeps company with its own past. The darkness below is not a void, but a room where former life rests and slowly changes. And as we drift through that room, the imagined walls are made of brown fibers and cool water. There is no need for light here. There is no need for sound. The surface above continues, but it reaches us only as pressure and chemistry. You can let your thoughts become equally dim and comfortable, not lost, just less separate, like plant fragments gradually joining the quiet body of peat. The science stays with us gently. Organic matter is made mostly of carbon-rich compounds produced by plants. In ordinary aerobic conditions, microbes can break much of that material down into carbon dioxide, water, nutrients, and humus. In waterlogged peat, oxygen is limited, so decomposition is incomplete. Some carbon remains stored in the accumulating organic layer. Over long periods, this incomplete decay becomes a major feature of the landscape. It is incomplete, but not unfinished in any troubling sense. It is complete as peat. The point is not for every fragment to vanish. The point, if nature can be said to have one here, is that certain conditions allow remains to persist. The Somerset Levels became a place where persistence mattered. Their wet hollows, fens, and former bogs held plant matter long enough for it to become part of the land's identity. You can imagine identity as something quiet too. Not a label, not a boundary on a map, but a recurring feeling. Low sky, wet fields, brown water, reeds, mist, dark peat. The Somerset Levels are recognized by these sensations as much as by any name. When we repeat the name, It comes with the smell of saturated soil and the sight of flat land holding water like a memory. And as we move with that memory, we pass into a quieter afternoon, perhaps after rain, when every surface is damp, the reed stems shine, the ditch banks are dark, the air feels soft on the skin, without the dryness that makes sounds brittle. Your hand, if you touched a gatepost or a willow branch, would come away cool. Even the silence seems moist, as though it has absorbed the weather. Rain after a dry spell can darken peatland surfaces quickly. The upper soil swells. Ditches rise. Small hollows fill. The scent of organic matter lifts as water reconnects fragments, pores and root channels. For peat, re-wetting can restore some of the protective conditions that slow decay, though the deeper story depends on duration and consistency. Still, the first return of water feels like relief in the landscape's body. You can imagine water entering cracks in dried peat, softening edges, filling spaces, lowering the presence of air. The material that had tightened begins to swell. Fibers take in moisture, the color deepens, the peat becomes more like itself again, closer to the saturated state in which it formed. The Somerset Levels, after rain, often carry that sense of rejoining, as if separated parts of the wetland have been connected by water once more. That rejoining happens at many scales. A drop joins a blade of grass, a trickle joins a ditch joins a river, groundwater joins the peat's hidden pores, dissolved carbon joins the brown flow. The system is linked not by force but by contact. Water touches, enters, carries and leaves. Through these small contacts, the conditions for peat formation are maintained or restored. And below the wet surface, the older peat receives the changed pressure of the water above. It does not think, of course, but it responds physically. Saturated peat can swell, drained peat can shrink. Compression and drying can alter its structure. Keeping it wet helps preserve volume and organic matter. These are practical truths, but spoken softly, they become part of the same lullaby of water holding darkness in place. The listener may now be far from full waking, but the Somerset Levels remain easy to return to. If you drift away and come back, there are the same reeds, the same brown water, the same low mist, the same slow formation of peat. The repetition is deliberate because the landscape itself repeats. Its calm comes from returning patterns, and you can enter those patterns at any point without needing to find the beginning. We are somewhere in the middle now, which is where peat always seems to be. The surface is above older layers and below future ones. The present is a thin band between what has settled and what will settle. A reed growing tonight may become part of the upper peat long after this moment is gone. A root already dying below the surface may be entering the first stage of that passage now. And, as we rest with this middle, the light changes again to evening. The sky lowers into pearl grey. Waterbirds move as soft shapes across the fields. Rushes draw dark lines against the lighter water. The smell is cool, mineral, and green-brown. You can feel a slight chill in the air, the kind that makes a blanket feel heavier and kinder. The land outside the imagination and the land within it begin to fold together. There is no sharp edge between natural history and rest here. To understand peat, you must accept slowness. To fall asleep, you also accept slowness. The Somerset Levels offer both. Their peat formed through countless quiet acts, none sufficient alone, all powerful together. Your own descent into sleep may be similar, made of small relaxations rather than one sudden change, a loosening of the jaw, a deepening breath, a thought allowed to pass. The wetland does not ask you to follow every detail. It gives enough sensory anchors to float by. Cool air, damp grass, brown water, reed whisper, dark peat, pale sky. These are simple things, but each contains depth. The air carries moisture from the land. The grass grows on organic soil. The water protects what lies below. The reeds feed future layers. The peat holds the past in a form you can almost smell. And below those anchors we come again to the quiet role of temperature. Cool conditions slow many biological processes. In peatlands, lower temperatures can reduce the rate of decomposition. helping organic matter accumulate when waterlogging is also present. The Somerset Levels are not Arctic, but their damp, temperate climate has often supported persistent wetness. Cloud, rain and low relief all contribute to the soft conditions in which peat could form. Temperature works with water rather than alone. Warm, saturated peat may still preserve material better than warm, dry soil, because oxygen remains limited. Cold, dry material may not form peat if plant production and preservation do not align. The magic, if we may use a gentle word, is in the combination. Plant growth must be abundant enough, water high enough, oxygen limited enough, and time long enough. Then the dark layer grows. You can hold those conditions like smooth stones in the palm. Growth, water, low oxygen, time. Each one is simple. Together they make peat. The Somerset Levels are one of the places where these conditions have overlapped across long spans, creating a landscape whose depth comes from organic accumulation rather than hard rock alone. It is a soft geology, made by the patience of wet life. Soft geology is a good phrase to rest inside. It suggests that stone is not the only way to be ancient. Peat can be young near the top and ancient below, fragile when dried and enduring when wet. It can be cut, compressed, preserved, lost, renewed, and read. It is geological because it forms part of the Earth's layered record, and soft because it remains close to the plant bodies that made it. And as we move through this soft geology, the Somerset Levels continue to widen around us. You may picture the land at dusk, its fields divided by gleaming lines of water, its hedges low and dark, its reed beds breathing in the breeze. The horizon is far away, but not dramatic. It is simply where the flatness fades into air. Beneath all that width lies the downward depth of peat, quiet and unseen. The body can feel wide and deep at once, too. The breath widens the ribs. The bed deepens beneath your weight. Thoughts spread out and settle down. The landscape becomes a mirror for this sensation. Not because it is trying to comfort, but because its nature is already calm. The levels have made room for water, and the water has made room for peat, and the peat has made room for old life to rest. In the uppermost peat, living roots complicate the boundary between past and present. Some roots grow into older material, drawing nutrients released by slow decomposition. Fungal threads may pass through. Tiny invertebrates may move in oxygenated microspaces near the surface. The peat is not sealed away there. It is part of the living root zone, involved in exchange. Only deeper down does the world become more fully saturated, darker, and more protected. This gradual transition is important because it keeps the peatland alive. If the surface were entirely cut off, new accumulation would stop. If the lower layers were too exposed, preservation would fail. The system depends on a living top and a protected depth. The Somerset Levels show this balance in their own low, damp way, with visible plants above and dark organic matter below, each requiring the other. You can imagine a cross-section of the ground as a quiet vertical gradient. Green shoots at the top, brown litter beneath, fibrous young peat below that, darker, denser peat deeper still, then perhaps clay or silt, or another peat bed depending on the place. Water threads through everything. The air touches only the uppermost spaces. Downward, the world becomes less aerated, less bright, more enclosed, and more slow. The descent is gentle enough that the mind barely notices it. We began with a fallen stem, and now we are within the deeper body of the levels again. This is how the landscape teaches, by letting one detail lead into the whole. A leaf becomes a layer becomes a bed becomes a wetland plain. The Somerset Levels become not just a place on the earth, but a long act of holding. And as the act of holding continues, we come to another sensory surface, a small pool edged with sedge, under a sky the color of watered milk. The pool is shallow, and its bottom is dark with organic mud. When the wind is absent, the reflection is clear. When the wind passes, the reeds move first, then the water wrinkles, then the reflection breaks into soft pieces. Nothing moves quickly enough to startle you. At the edge, sedge leaves arch over the water. Their bases are crowded, tough and wet. Dead leaves collect among them, forming a mat that catches more debris. Fine roots penetrate the mat and bind it together. Over time, this edge can creep inward over open water. The pool narrows, the plant mat thickens. The conditions for peat formation strengthen as more organic matter accumulates and decay remains limited. This inward growth from the edge is one of the quietest ways land appears. It does not arrive as dry ground at first. It arrives as floating or saturated vegetation, trembling, water-filled, and soft. You might step on it and feel it move. Below, plant remains gather in the shallow water. Above, new shoots root into the mat. The boundary between water and land becomes a slow living weave. In the Somerset Levels, many former wet surfaces would have changed through similar edges, though each in its own setting: pools infilled, channels silted, fens expanded, wet woodland developed, peat accumulated wherever the balance favored preservation. The result is a landscape that has repeatedly turned water into wet ground and wet ground into deeper organic soil, without losing its watery character entirely. You can sense that watery character even in the word levels. It suggests flatness, yes, but also water finding a plane, spreading evenly, resting where the land allows. A level surface can be calm because it has stopped rushing. The Somerset Levels are not motionless, but their movements are low and spreading. That is why peat could form here. Not because the world stopped, but because movement slowed enough for organic matter to stay. And below the pool's dark bottom, where the first organic mud thickens into peat, we descend again into the first stages of burial. The material is soft and loose. It contains bits of leaf, root, algae, and fine sediment. Water fills almost everything. Oxygen disappears quickly after it is used. The color darkens with depth. The smell, if released, would be earthy and faintly sour, the smell of organic matter held in wetness. This smell is one of the strongest sensory links to peat. It is not simply dirt. It has a preserved quality, like old wood kept under water, like leaves sealed beneath a pond, like rain that has traveled through roots. When people describe peat, they often reach for memory as much as description. It smells old, even when the upper layer is young, because it carries the atmosphere of things kept from quick return. You can breathe that imagined scent slowly, without heaviness. It belongs to a clean natural process, to wetland chemistry and patient decay. The Somerset Levels, in their damp hollows and dark soils, offer that scent as part of their identity. It rises after rain, from ditch banks, from disturbed ground, from places where water and old plant matter meet the air for a moment before closing again. And as the air closes, the buried matter continues to darken. The difference between fresh plant and peat is not just age, but transformation. Cell walls break down in part. Soluble compounds leach away. More resistant materials linger. Microbial byproducts accumulate. The mass becomes more chemically complex and more physically compact. It is still descended from plants, yet it has become something else. A soil, a sediment, a record, and a store. There is no need to choose only one name for it. Peat can be all these things at once. It is soil when plants root in it. It is sediment when we read it as a deposited layer. It is habitat when it holds water for living communities. It is archive when it preserves pollen and fragments. It is carbon store when we consider its place in the wider Earth system. In the Somerset Levels, it is also atmosphere, the dark foundation of a wetland feeling. The listener can rest inside that many-sidedness without needing to analyze it. A thing may be complex and still calming. The peat does not become restless because it has many meanings. It remains dark, damp, and slow. We can move around it in thought the way mist moves around reeds, touching one side, then another, without disturbing the whole. And below that whole, the ancient lowland basin holds everything gently. The land's shape makes room for water. The water makes room for wetland plants. The plants make peat. The peat changes the land's capacity to hold water. The cycle turns, but not in a closed circle. It opens outward to climate, rivers, sea level, geology, and living communities. The Somerset Levels are a woven place, and peat is one of the deepest threads. If you picture a woven fabric, do not picture anything bright or tight. Picture something dark, damp, loose at the edges, made of roots and fibers, saturated and cool. Water is the thread that passes through everything, not visible in every strand, but necessary to the fabric's strength. Without it, the fibers dry and shrink. With it, they swell, connect, and preserve. The landscape holds together through wetness. That holding together can become the rhythm of the voice. A phrase rises, then settles. Another follows, then softens. Like reeds growing and bending, like water filling and lowering, like peat forming by addition and rest. The Somerset Levels continue beneath the words, and the words continue because the process continues, not toward an ending, but into deeper quiet. And as we turn toward that deeper quiet, the surface scene becomes even more subdued. The pool is behind us now. The reed bed returns. The sky is dim. The air is cool enough that every scent seems closer to the ground. Wet leaves, old stems, dark mud, and still water mingle in a low fragrance. You can feel the softness of the bank beneath your imagined hand, and the slight chill of moisture against your palm. The bank itself is a small cross-section of the peatland's life. Grasses root in the top. Rushes grow near the wet margin. Below them, dark organic soil shows where the edge has been exposed. Threads of root hang from the cut face. Water seeps from the lower part, making it shine. If you looked closely, you might see the difference between newer, fibrous material and older, darker peat beneath. But we do not look too sharply now. We let the details come and go. The bank is simply a reminder that the ground has depth. The Somerset Levels are not a painted surface, but a body of accumulated wetland matter. The reeds above are like breath. The peat below is like memory. The water between them is like the quiet that lets breath and memory remain connected. When plant matter first enters the peat-forming zone, it may still contain nutrients valuable to living organisms. Some are released and reused. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and other elements cycle through the wetland, though their availability depends on chemistry and water movement. In nutrient-poor peatlands, plants adapt to scarcity. In richer fens, growth may be lush. The Somerset Levels have held both richness and limitation in different places, creating varied wetland communities. Scarcity can be peaceful when seen in this context. It does not mean emptiness. It means specialization, careful use, slow cycling. Plants in peatlands often live with what the water and soil provide, and their forms reflect those conditions. Fine roots, hollow stems, water-holding tissues, tolerance of saturation. All these features help them inhabit the wet ground. They are quiet adaptations, not dramatic strategies. You can notice adaptations as small gestures. A reed stem hollow enough to carry air downward. A sedge tussock lifting new growth above wetness. A moss cushion holding rain close. An alder root coping with saturated soil. Each gesture allows life to remain where many other plants would struggle, and each successful plant contributes, eventually, to the peat beneath. The adaptation becomes part of the accumulation, and as accumulation continues, the Somerset Levels become a landscape of mutual patience. Plants tolerate water. Water preserves plants. Peat holds water. Water sustains peat. The relationships are circular and slow, repeating across seasons without becoming monotonous. They are the kind of repetition that soothes because it is meaningful, like waves on a shore or rain on a roof, steady enough for the mind to stop measuring. The mind may drift now to the color of peat water, brown, amber, almost black in shade, golden at the edge where light passes through. That color comes from dissolved organic compounds, washed from plant remains and peat. It is a visible sign of the dark chemistry below. When you see brown water in a wetland ditch or pool, you are seeing the peatland tint the light, making water carry a trace of old vegetation. In the Somerset Levels, such water can make reflections feel deeper. A reed reflected in brown water has a softened outline. A cloud reflected there seems warmer and darker than the cloud above. The surface holds the sky, but the peat color rises through it, joining above and below in a single image. You can look into that water and feel that you are seeing two kinds of time at once, passing cloud and stored plant matter. And below the brown reflection, the peat continues its long preservation. It is not perfectly permanent. Given air and time, it can decay. Given water and care, it can persist. This balance gives peat its tenderness. It is ancient yet vulnerable. It is deep, yet made from soft remains. The Somerset Levels are peaceful partly because they make such tenderness visible in the land itself, without needing to speak of it directly. We speak of it softly, then let it rest. The main sensation remains the same. Low wet ground, cool air, reed beds, slow water, dark peat, a landscape that forms by holding what falls into it. A listener who has followed this far can begin to feel the pattern without effort, as though the words are only the surface ripples of a much slower process below. And as we sink again, we move into the grain of the peat, if peat can be said to have a grain. Fibers lie in different directions. Roots cross older roots. Fine organic particles fill small spaces. Water surrounds everything. The mass is not empty, but intricate. In some places, you could pull apart strands. In others, it would smear smooth and dark. The texture records the degree of decomposition and the plants that contributed to it. Texture is touch made visible. Even if we never handle the peat, we can imagine it. Cool, damp, compressible, dense. It might cling to the fingers. It might break in dark crumbs if partly dried. It might shine when freshly exposed. The smell would rise immediately, connecting hand, ground, and memory. The Somerset Levels are a place where the earth can feel almost tactile even from a distance, because its story is so bound to softness. That softness, however, does not mean the peat is simple. Organic compounds in peat can bind metals, hold nutrients, influence acidity, and affect water quality. The peat body can slow runoff and store water. It can change the timing of flows across a lowland. It can support specialized plants and animals. Beneath its quiet surface, it participates in many processes at once, all of them shaped by its wet organic nature. You do not need to follow every process to be calmed by the whole. Sometimes knowing that complexity is present beneath simplicity is enough. A flat wet field becomes more beautiful when you know it contains layered processes. A brown ditch becomes more beautiful when you know its color comes from old plant matter. A reed bed becomes more beautiful when you know its roots may be helping to make future peat. And as future peat begins in the present, we return once more to the upper layer, where fresh plant litter lies among living stems. This is the newest edge of the archive. It is soft, irregular, and changeable. Some of it will decompose quickly. Some will be carried by water. Some will be eaten, broken, or dissolved. Some will remain in place long enough to be buried by the next season's growth. The archive begins imperfectly, and that is part of its truth. The Somerset Levels do not preserve every moment, only enough to form continuity. In that way, they resemble memory itself. Much passes, some stays. What stays is altered by the conditions of keeping: a smell, a color, a texture, a trace. Peat is the wetland's memory, but not a photograph. It is a transformed memory, darkened, compressed, and made useful as ground. This transformed memory can hold beauty without brightness. The deepest peat is not colorful in the usual sense, but its darkness has richness. It can be brown like old tea, black like wet bark, red-brown where fibers remain, or grayed where mineral matter mingles. The beauty is in depth, texture, and origin. It is the beauty of something that has been held for a long time and has become quiet because of it. And below that quiet beauty, the levels continue to receive the slow influence of the sky. Cloud cover changes evaporation. Rain changes saturation. Sun changes plant growth. Wind moves water and bends reeds. Frost slows the surface. Warmth wakes roots. The peat is underground, but it is never fully separate from weather. Weather writes itself downward through water and plants, entering the archive by way of growth and preservation. You can imagine a cloudy summer day on the Somerset Levels. warm but not hot, with a mild breeze moving over damp fields. The reed beds are green and full, and the ditches are half hidden by leaves. Beneath that living abundance, roots are expanding, microbes are working, and the upper peat is receiving fine organic inputs. The day looks still, but it is quietly productive. Light becomes biomass. Biomass becomes future peat. Then, imagine a cool winter day, with the same place subdued under grey light. Growth is minimal. Water stands higher. Decomposition slows. Fallen material rests saturated. The landscape is not producing much new plant tissue, but it is protecting what has fallen. Peat formation needs both kinds of time, the growing time and the keeping time. The Somerset Levels move between them with the seasons, each one contributing differently to the dark layer below. And as we move between those seasonal moods, the listener can move between waking and sleep without needing to choose. The words remain steady. The reeds remain steady. The peat remains steady. If attention fades, the landscape continues. If attention returns, there is always a sensory place to land, the smell of wet soil, the hush of rushes, the coolness of water, the wide flat sky above the levels. The wide sky is important because it makes the ground feel even lower. Clouds pass slowly, and their shadows move across fields with hardly any edge. Light spreads rather than falls. At certain times the horizon almost dissolves, and the world seems made of bands: water, grass, reed, mist, cloud. Beneath those bands, peat lies in hidden bands of its own. The visible flatness and hidden layering belong together. A peatland can feel like a sleeping thing under such a sky. Not asleep as in inactive, but asleep as in deeply regulated, breathing, storing, repairing, and continuing without spectacle. The Somerset Levels have that feeling when water is high and the wind is low. The whole place seems to have lowered its pulse. Even a passing bird seems to cross it gently, as though respecting the hush. And beneath that hush, we descend once more toward an older layer, where the plant remains are so altered that only traces of their original forms remain. The peat here is denser. It may be smoother. It has been pressed longer and held longer in the dark. Its water has moved through countless microscopic pathways. Its compounds have shifted and stabilized. It is old wetland life, but spoken now in the language of earth. The transition from biology to earth is one of the central wonders of peat. It does not require heat like coal formation, though coal begins with ancient plant matter under much greater burial and geological transformation. Peat is earlier, softer, closer to life. It still smells like wet vegetation. It still may show fibers. It is geology at the threshold of ecology, and ecology entering the patience of geology. In the Somerset Levels, this threshold is not an abstract boundary. It is under fields, reeds, and watercourses. It is the reason the ground behaves as it does, the reason some places hold water, shrink when drained, or darken when wet. The peat body influences the surface even when unseen. It is not just buried history. It is an active part of the living landscape's present form. You can rest with that active buriedness. Many important things are like that. They are not visible, but they shape what is visible. The peat shapes wetness, vegetation, carbon storage, and the feel of the land. It shapes the smell after rain. It shapes the color of water. It shapes the slight give underfoot. The Somerset Levels are themselves because of what lies below, as much as because of what spreads above. And as the next breath moves in and out, we let the scene soften again into near darkness. Reeds stand still. Ditches are black lines under a muted sky. The peat below holds a cold that changes slowly. Water rests in its pores. Old roots, no longer roots in the living sense, remain as fibers and traces. The process has no need of our attention, but it allows our attention to rest upon it. There is a lovely humility in such a process. Peat does not rise like a mountain or carve like a river gorge. It does not ask the eye to admire height or force. It simply gathers what grows in wet places and keeps part of it. The Somerset Levels reveal that the earth can be shaped by gentleness over time, by the accumulation of small soft things under conditions of patience. The phrase small soft things could describe much of this landscape: moss tips, reed leaves, sedge roots, pollen grains, raindrops, mud particles, insect wings, fallen seeds. Each is fragile alone. Together, in the wet keeping of the levels, they contribute to a landform. The strength is not in any single part, but in the steady relation among them, repeated through more seasons than a mind can comfortably hold. You do not have to hold all those seasons. Let them hold you instead. Let the thought of them become broad and indistinct. The Somerset Levels stretch out under the night, and beneath them the peat lies in darkness, carrying layer after layer of old wetland life. The newest fallen stem is beginning to soften above the older mass. The oldest layers remain below, cool and pressed, as the slow formation continues through the quiet hours. And as those quiet hours deepen, moisture gathers again on every blade, every reed, every exposed edge of dark soil. The air has the taste of rain even before rain comes. The ditches wait with a stillness that feels almost listening. Somewhere below the surface, water moves through the peat too slowly to hear, touching old fibers, carrying faint brown compounds, maintaining the saturated hush that lets the buried record remain. It is enough, now, to let that hidden movement continue without following it closely. The Somerset Levels lie under the darkening sky, low and damp and patient, while the peat beneath the reeds keeps its cool interior. Water holds the old plant matter in a long, soft pause. Roots from this year touch the remains of years before. The newest fallen leaves rest near the surface, and deeper down, older stems have lost their names and become part of the ground. You can feel the quietest layer now, not as a place to reach, but as a place to rest. It is dark there, and wet, and steady. No light needs to enter, no sound needs to travel. The old peat is pressed gently beneath everything above it, beneath the grasses, beneath the rinds, beneath the pale mist that will return when morning comes. It is not empty darkness. It is the darkness of things kept safe by water and time. Above it, the reeds may move once in the night air, then settle again. A drop slips from a blade into the ditch, and the ring it makes widens, softens, and disappears. The water closes over its own reflection. The field returns to stillness. Underneath, the long formation goes on too slowly to watch, each season giving itself to the next, each small remain joining the deep brown hush below. And you can rest with it now. Let the ground be soft beneath the thought. Let the dark peat hold its old quiet without asking anything more from you. Far across the Somerset Levels, the water lies still among the reeds, and below it the ancient plants sleep in the earth, gathered close, cool and silent.